Comes to a lot of meetings.
You guys hear me? Hello? Oh, okay.
You started? Okay,
Good morning, Scott. Good morning, Marvin. How are you?
The judge is still not here yet.
All right, did I see Lydia?
Yeah, Lydia is here, but the judge is not.
All right. Good morning, Lydia.
Morning. Is it snowing
Good morning,
up there?
Marvin. Not yet.
No, you
How about down there?
It's snowing.
It is, but it's not bad.
All right. We have 7, so I don't know. Do we have any ETA on the judge? Maybe we'll get started. I'm a little concerned about whether or not the weather down there is going to cause us problems as the day goes on. And if we get to anything where we need the judge, we can always put it off.
We get clarity on the pictures.
I think
That's it? Is that the best we're going to do?
Yeah. See, your guys' video quality isn't great, but I don't know if there's anything to change that.
All right. Let me check and see. I think they're taking a look at it.
Mike looks like Cynthia.
Jackie, they're indicating that the picture down there is not good. Marvin, are you sure it's just not the way I appear?
Pardon?
Are you sure it's just not the way I normally look?
And you just look blurry to me, Mike. But for the fact you're at the head of the table, I wouldn't know.
He said there's no way to make it better. It's the network traffic.
All right, we're being told it's the network traffic, and there's no way they can make it better.
Okay.
Did you hear that? We're being told it's the network traffic, and that they cannot improve the quality.
It's okay.
Can you hear?
Yes.
us? Okay.
Yes.
We can hear you.
All right.
Yes.
All right. If
You know
there's any,
if Mike, do you know
Go
if
ahead.
the webinar is on today?
I'm being told yes.
It is? Okay.
All right. If at any point there's any issue hearing, or if the picture gets worse, let us know.
Okay.
All right, so first of all, welcome. I appreciate everyone being here, especially for the people in New York. Thank you for braving the weather. I appreciate it. We do have a quorum right now. We have, looks like exactly 7. Judge Mazzarelli is expected, so that will give us 8. The first thing we have on the agenda is review and approval of the meeting agenda. I believe that was sent out and everyone received a copy before the meeting. Are there any comments or discussion before we approve, or before we ask for a motion to approve the agenda?
Yes.
Yes, Marvin.
I wanted to establish that the agenda includes an accreditation update from the New York State Police Crime Lab, pages 173 to 223 of the commission booklet. It's a very lengthy report of nonconformities, and I just want to be sure that it's on the agenda, and if we don't get through it, that we'll have time, if not at today's meeting, to go through it at the next meeting. I think that's my question.
It's
50
under number.
pages.
Yeah, it's under number 4, I believe you're referring to, under accreditation / laboratory update, and it's item
4D.
D. Yeah,
D
I
as in
can't
David.
I can't see how we wouldn't get to it. That should be very early in the meeting. So, but yeah, certainly, if for any reason something happens and we don't, by all means, there'll be time next meeting. But I think we'll have plenty of time here. All right. Other than that, do I have any? Oh, okay. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Marvin.
It's okay. The other thing I wanted to ask is if we could put on the agenda a discussion regarding procedures whereby DCJS has to report nonconformities to the commission. I don't know if we have such a procedure, if such a thing exists. but I'm interested in finding out, does DCJS, I thought it might handle DNA requests or evidence from laboratories, and if there's a nonconformity attributed to DCJS, is there a nonconformity procedure for DCJS to report to this commission? And if there's nothing, we put that on?
Why don't we add that after number 5 and before number 6? 5 is old business, 6 is lab disclosures. So we can add in new business, and you can address whatever you want there under that. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, with that, do I have a motion to approve the agenda?
Motion.
All right, do I have a second? Scott?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? All right, thank you. Next item we have is review and approval of the draft minutes of our December 8th, 2017 meeting. I've received, I believe you've all received a draft copy of the minutes from that meeting. Are there any questions or comments with regard to the minutes? All right, if not, do I have a motion to approve the minutes from that meeting?
So moved.
All right, do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? And any abstentions? That passes unanimously. The next item we have, number 4 on the agenda, accreditation/laboratory updates. Brian, do you want to take us through those?
Sure. First item under that agenda item is the Monroe County Crime Laboratory. You received documents which are in your binder, page 7 through 10. Members of the laboratory are here and available if there's any questions. This is an informational update and does not require a vote.
I just have a question on one of their statements on page 7. It says,
Maybe Jonathan can come up.
just for my own edification,
Sure.
it says, we make identification in DNA which are independent of CODIS. We don't maintain a suspect database. Could you just clarify that?
That's correct. So in moving forward in the switch from AskLab Lab to ANAB, ANAB has added the individual characteristic database, and they're applying it to all labs. We were just clarifying to them because we were really not understanding that standard that they put forth. So we just clarified to them that we don't maintain a suspect database.
Okay, and then the sentence prior to that, we make DNA identification which are independent of CODIS, meaning just within the case?
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
When you say within the case, if you have a sample from a crime scene, you develop a profile from it, and then a subject sample is submitted to you, you're saying you make those comparisons?
Yes.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
The next item on the agenda is the New York City Police Department Laboratory. So they had a
Brian?
reaccreditation assessment.
Brian, can you hang on a second?
Yep.
The judge just arrived. Let her get settled. You're welcome.
Good morning, Judge.
These are the veteran warriors, right?
Exactly.
Thank you for making it with the weather down there. We appreciate it.
Misunderstood.
Sorry I'm late, but I got a little delayed.
No, no problem. We really appreciate you making it with the weather there, so thank you.
Thank you.
Brian,
Yeah.
you can start.
Okay. So the next item on the accreditation agenda is the New York City Police Department Laboratory. So they had a reaccreditation assessment that passed October. So the documents are in your binder from pages 11 to 133. Dr. O'Neill's present to represent the laboratory if there's any questions. This item is required for a vote.
Yeah, I did have a couple of questions.
Okay.
All right, so on page 15, I think maybe there's a typo. So on the end of the letter from Caprice, she says leaving only 2.4 under toxicology.
Yes.
But then on the form, on the certificate on page 17, it says 2.5. So is it supposed to be 2.4 or 2.5?
The 2.5 is the beverage alcohol analysis. We had 2.4, which was blood alcohol analysis, which after the assessment,
Yeah.
we got it removed due to all the evidence was now being submitted to the forensic toxicology laboratory at OCME.
Okay. All right, maybe I misunderstood her wording,
Yeah.
saying leaving 2.4, so I thought that
Yeah.
meant that was staying. I did have another question, just maybe for me to learn. On pages 18 and 19 about the trigger pull nonconformance, does your lab use the spring-loaded or the digital meter, or do you use something else?
We use weights.
You use weights?
Yes.
Okay, so I didn't see, I Googled
I was
it.
curious about that
Yeah.
too, Lydia.
Yeah.
How do they make sure it's...
So how do they know that it's accurate? Are the weights calibrated and?
If you don't mind, during the assessment, I was actually out long-term sick.
okay.
So I have my quality assurance manager here.
Sure.
So just to make sure you get the right answer.
Okay,
If
sure.
she could join the table.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, the weights are calibrated.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think the other thing that I noticed was that on the on all of the retesting, they used weight set A. Is there only one weight set?
No, there are two weight sets that we have because while we're getting one calibrated, it'll be sent out of the laboratory. They tend to only have one of them out at any given time because they don't want to intermingle the weights. So they use them per set. So weight set A was just the one in use at that time.
Why do you have to recalibrate them then? What do they look like, this calibration?
They're stainless steel weights. We calibrate them every 1 year to 18 months just to make sure that they haven't lost any weight to them. They're metal, they're stainless steel, so if they got damaged, they could lose some of their precision.
Are they considered measuring equipment under 5.5.6?
Yeah, well, we consider not measuring equipment.
No.
We consider them reference materials,
Reference materials.
reference standards.
Reference
Yeah.
standards, okay. That's all I have.
All right, anything else? Thank you.
So at this point, we would need a motion for a vote to accredit the laboratory for the same period concurrent with their A&AB accreditation from January 9th, 2018 to March 31st, 2022.
Do we have a motion?
So moved.
And do we have a second? Is that Judge? All right. All in favor? And anyone opposed? And any abstentions?
One abstention.
All right, so that's 7 for, none against, and 1 abstaining. Thank you.
The next item is the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner of Forensic Biology. This past October, they underwent an expanded surveillance visit. Documentation in your binder, pages 134 to 172. I'm not sure if people were able to make it to the meeting. If not, they're available by phone if there's questions.
Meredith is here.
Okay. Hearing none, this was for informational purposes. The next item is the New York State Police Crime Laboratory.
Brian, just a second. I had
Sure
a
thing.
question on note 3 on page 134. I didn't quite understand the first sentence. Laboratories should be aware that judicial decisions in many jurisdictions hold that forensic DNA results must be accompanied by a statistic that qualifies the weight of the evidence in order for testimony regarding those results to be admissible in court. What do you mean by the statistic?
Even more, what decisions?
Well, that's my next. I just don't quite get that that note.
Well, this notice is from the accreditation. This is their language. This is not our language.
Okay, because the weight of the evidence is a standard that's used in New York State. That it has a special meaning in the law, and I didn't know if that was what they were referring to, or actual weighing something, or.
We'd have to ask A&AB exactly what their intention is with their notes and statements for the standards.
So this is not your note, although it's on your letterhead.
So what I did was I quoted what their finding was, and they basically included the standard and the notes accompanying that standard as part of the finding. So I just copied so that everyone could see what exactly they were referencing.
I was just a little confused about that note.
Well, did you all understand what it meant?
So our understanding is that there is a certain amount of weight that courts are expecting accompany DNA result, for example, inclusion, exclusion, or a statistical weight to it. And so we try to comply with this request of our customers as we go into court, that we can either have included, excluded, no conclusions, or a statistical weight if we can.
Because now the New York State courts are requiring that the person who actually participated in the testing, be available for examination, as I'm sure you know, Marvin.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yes, Marvin.
I just want to be sure we're all on the same page. As you understand their note, because you have to understand it in order to do your business, are you saying when you perceive that you go to court and you state somebody's excluded or included or there's inconclusivity, that it has to be accompanied by sworn testimony as to the probability of that finding?
Our accrediting body in the past there was a board decision that any positive associations carry some sort of weight with it, and so we strive to reach that level when reporting our results, if possible. When it comes to testimony, I don't really understand what your question is. We will testify to whatever our reported results are.
Right. But this note says there's a statistic that qualifies the weight of the evidence. What do you understand that to mean in terms of testimony? That somebody has to quote a statistic that says we're excluding Schechter's client to 99.2%, or excluding it 1 billion and 1 trillion that's not Schechter's client. Is that how you understand that?
Whatever we determine to be the weight of association of a known person to an item of evidence is what we testify to.
Gotcha. Mike?
Yes, Marvin.
It would seem to me that it's not out of the ordinary for the commission to send a letter to ANAB, because they're new, and have them tell us what that note means, what that line that Judge Mazzarelli was referring to, what it means to them. And did they base that note upon New York court decisions, federal decisions? Because if we don't understand it on the commission, it's very hard to expect our labs to understand what that note means. And here we have somebody from a very reputable lab quoting to us and putting into the report the ANAB quote, and at some future date, if they don't understand what it means, how do we evaluate whether or not a report was correct or not correct?
Well, the second sentence of that note qualifies it to some extent, telling the party that's interested, the interested party, the laboratory officials, to consult with the legal authorities in their local jurisdiction. Right. So that qualifies that part of what you're saying. My question was, I didn't understand what this what the word statistic and weight meant, if it was a term of art in scientific usage, or if it was referencing the legal definition of weight.
As far as I think most DNA laboratories are concerned, but I can really only speak for ours, statistical weight references the association of a particular known person's profile to.
So it's not like weighing.
No, correct.
It has nothing
correct.
to do with the weight, the physical weight of something. It has to do with
how likely
right.
their profile is
Right.
to that sample, to that mixture.
I'm satisfied with that answer.
All right, thank you.
The next item on the agenda is the New York State Police Crime Laboratory. They just had their first assessment or a reaccreditation assessment, but this is their first assessment under the new ANAB program. Documents associated with that are in your binders on page 173 to 223. And also, there's some additional documents that are in front of you with blue page numbers or additional documents of 223.1 to 223.6. And members of that laboratory are available if there's any questions.
I have a few questions. Who's available from the lab?
I believe Ray is coming up, Marvin.
Okay.
Good morning, Ray.
What's the second name?
Wickenheiser.
Wickenheiser.
Lab director.
Good morning. My name is Ray Wickenheiser. I'm the lab director of New York State Police Crime Lab System.
Good morning, Mr. Wickenheiser. It's Marvin Schechter here in New York.
Good morning.
How are you?
Good, and yourself?
I can't complain. I'd like to turn first to page 197 of the commission book, which refers to a New York State Police memorandum dated February 28th, 2018. Do you see that memo?
I have it in front of me. Yes.
And are you familiar with the memo?
Yes.
Could you explain to me what this memo says as shortly as possible?
Yeah, I actually have the author of the memo, Dr. Russ Gettig, here in attendance, so I could probably have him come up and explain it directly.
That'd be great.
Sure.
Is he the?
Russ is the technical leader.
Yeah, but why is the from blacked out?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's to Russ. At any rate, maybe Russ can better describe.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question that Mr. Fitzpatrick had.
I asked why the author of the memo on 197 is blacked out.
Yeah, what's the answer to that?
I don't know. I did not black it out.
Is that something we redacted?
Yes, it has to do with organizational structure.
Right. So I believe
Just
that
before you go on, the documents that come in, there's a set path they go through, and people whose names are not within the top management structure of the laboratory, those names are blacked out. They're redacted as part of the rest of the organizational structure of the laboratory.
Right. So, who wrote this memo? Mr. Getty?
No, I did not write this memo.
So, who wrote the memo?
So this would be written by one of our staff individuals just in preparation or response to the accreditation findings, what our corrective actions would be.
Okay. All right. Mr. Gettig, you reviewed the memo?
Yes, I did.
Can you explain this memo, what it means, what it's covering? What is the problem here?
The ANAB audit finding had to do with our restricted interpretation analysis of complex mixtures, and it had to do with their interviews with the analysts, where they apparently had some confusion in answering some certain questions about the analysis procedure. I don't know what questions they asked. I don't know which analysts were interviewed. However, that was a finding under the management section of the ANAB audit document,
And so this is kind of a detailed response of what we are doing to try to improve the understanding of the analysts on this procedure using a restricted approach for like a 3+ person mixture.
Were you aware, Mr. Gettig or Mr. Wickenhauser, that there was a problem prior to the ANAB? I'm sorry. Mr. Fitzpatrick was asking a question. I'm sorry.
No, I was not, Mark. I think
that was
overheard Ray talk.
Yeah, that was just me making a brief comment to Mr. Gettig that I would respond to your question. So to respond to that question, no, we were not. As in, we had a A2LA audit on all of this same documentation the previous year, within a year of having this audit, and all of the same procedures were looked at, same validations, except for perhaps one, were already in place, and we had no findings on any of this material. So that's not uncommon. You have two different auditors come through. They have different eyes. They felt in their interviews that it was not as clear as it could or should be. So as a result, we were adding some additional training, doing some clarification, making improvements. So this, to me, is just a continuous improvement model that we all subscribe to. Different auditors see different things. We welcome that, and we're making those improvements to address that finding.
Well, let me ask you this. The area where you're continually improving involves apparently the determination of whether there's an exclusion, an inclusion, or inconsistency or inconclusiveness. Am I right?
Well, in very broad brush strokes, yes, but we didn't get specifically from the auditors what people needed to understand better, just that there was some, people needed to be clearer on these are interpretations of very complex mixtures, that they just saw some inconsistencies. They felt that people needed to be better apprised of what we're doing. We put in a new mixture interpretation tool that was to assist them in being consistent, and that when they were asking questions that people needed to be a little better versed in their answers. So hence the additional training, making improvements to the tool, just a continuous improvement of a system that we put in place. As I said previously, had no findings in a previous audit from A2LA. Now they've seen things that we are improving upon, and hence these are the improvements.
With respect to the fact that you are now improving by adding training, did these findings from ANAB, coming 1 year after A2LA, prompt you to do a review of any reports involving DNA findings with this 3-to-1 ratio and any misunderstandings that the staff may have had in how to interpret these mixtures?
Okay, so maybe if I could break that apart. For the first one, the ratios that you're referring to when they looked at our validations, the question was not with the validity of the ratios themselves, but rather the testing that we had done, that we had enough replicates of those samples to demonstrate that those, and these are very standard ratios that many crime labs subscribe to. So we did some additional supplemental testing, added in some additional samples in that ratio range, and our results have shown that, yes, in fact, they are valid. That is not a shock. We just needed to do some additional replicates. Those have been done. So the ratios that we're using are tried and true, and our additional supplemental are shoring that up. So our testing has shown that that is valid. Now, to the other part of your question, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Now, to the other part of your question, that understanding and people working on complex mixtures is always an ongoing challenge to make sure that when you have mixtures that people are going to interpret them consistently.
What I'm more zeroing in on, Mr. Wickenheiser, is the issue of did this finding of a lack of understanding or being more specific prompt you to do a review of any past reports of DNA testing and reporting to see if the results were correct or incorrect in view of these new findings?
Okay. Perhaps if I could refer that to Dr. Gettig.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention is that, it was the analysts who were being interviewed. And in any of our analysis, the report goes through an extensive review process. It goes through a peer review process, okay, by a peer, another analyst. It goes through what we call a secondary review, usually by a supervisor or of somebody analyst who is well versed in the technology and the protocols. And finally, there's an administrative review done on it. So, to my knowledge, nothing improper has gone out in any of our reports, because anything that would be improper would be caught on a review and corrected. A lot of times, it wasn't necessarily that something was wrong. It's a matter of the actual interpretation, to make sure that the interpretation that is being followed by the analyst follows the protocol.
So if the interpretation was incorrect, based upon not on the substantive part of the repeatability, but the interpretation was wrong, and the finding of ANAB was that people didn't understand exactly how to interpret these, did the fact of that lack of interpretation, notwithstanding that you had a process in place for catching mistakes beforehand, after this finding, did it cause you to go back and take a look and see if there had been any misinterpretations based upon the lack of understanding of what ANAB was now finding?
Well, they had flagged 3 cases in their review, and we went and looked at those cases, and there was nothing improper that went out in those, or incorrect that went out in the report for those cases. Currently, I'm reviewing all of this particular kind of interpretation. Analysts will come and I'll review it, and I haven't found any problems at this point. Okay. But I have not looked at any past cases.
You have not?
I have not looked specifically now at any past cases, no. Because I don't have any reason to believe that they're not correct.
Let me ask commission members to turn to page 201. This is a summary of a non-conforming working event and a corrective action tracking report dated January 18th, 2017. And gentlemen, if you can go to the bottom of the page, there's a section under nonconformity resolution. The following information was provided. The biology discipline has not documented interpretation procedures to the extent necessary to provide clear guidance on the proper application of the restricted CPI statistic as it applies to the interpretation of evidentiary DNA profiles. Do you see that, gentlemen?
Yes, we're looking at it now.
Yes.
Okay, so my first question is, can you explain to us what is restricted CPI?
Okay, so restricted CPI stands for the combined probability of inclusion. It's a specific statistical technique that assigns the weight or essentially how common or uncommon that profile may be. And we use this when we have a particularly complex mixture where we have 2 individuals or a mixture within a mixture where 2 of the individuals may be much stronger than contributor 3 and 4. So under those particular circumstances, we use a ratio to separate out the stronger contributors, that is contributor 1 and 2, from the more minor contributors, which may be contributor 3 and 4. And based on those differences of magnitude of the actual strength of the profile, we will then apply a restricted CPI, which is a statistic that only applies to the 2 major contributors and not look at the very minor contributors, because there's a significant separation between the strength of the first 2 contributors relative to contributors 3 and 4.
How do you determine the ratio for the 2 greater of the 4?
There's typically a ratio.
Is that an interpretation that you do?
Yes, we do. So we typically have a 4-to-1 ratio separation, as in the first 2 contributors have to be 4 times stronger than the minor contributors to ensure that we can unambiguously select out the top 2 contributors and then apply the statistic to those 2.
And do you validate for that? Do you do a validation study?
Yes.
And did your validation studies for the 4-to-1 ratio that you set forward, did they support the 4-to-1?
And that was part of the actual finding in terms of running additional samples, and yes, they have supported that.
Let me turn to page 202. And at the very top of the page, there are 4 boxes. On the left, there's 2 boxes labeled 1 and 2. And on the right, 2 boxes named 1 and 2. I'm referring to the 2 boxes on the left on page 202 at the top. Box number 2 says interpretation procedures not documented to the extent necessary to provide enough guidance on the proper application of the restricted CPI statistic as it applies to the interpretation of evidentiary DNA profiles. Why was it that within the lab there were not documented the interpretation procedures?
Okay, so when we write these, we have full intentions of fully documenting it to make sure that people are clear. So when we undergo an audit, somebody is providing us objective validation or findings or non-compliance, whether that is the case. So we write them that we feel that they are consistent. We went through an audit and they found that we were in compliance. A second set of eyes came through and felt that we needed more guidance. So we welcome that, and in turn, if it is not clear and they go through and interview people and they're not as clear as they should be, we get a finding on that or a non-compliance, and in turn, we write more. So in this case, and when they had the interviews, if people didn't understand it because it is very complex, we then write additional and we provide additional training. So as I remarked before, that's part of continuous improvement in labs. We do want to make sure that our people understand it. If they find people that are not as clear as they could be, and we need to write even more than what we have, because we have a lot of pages and we have spent a lot of time training people, but this is an ongoing process. Complex mixture interpretation is one of the more challenging things that we do, and we want to make sure we do it as well as we can.
So I just want to be sure I understand what you're saying. When it says here at the top of page 202 of the commission book in box number 2 on the left, that the interpretation procedures were not documented to the extent necessary, what you're telling us is you had documented procedures. They were there. They were written down, and people could read them and understand them so they would know how to do these complex interpretations of complex mixtures in the best way possible. But what you're saying is that when the people came through from ANAB, they didn't feel your written, documented procedures were sufficient, and they wanted you to improve them. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That's correct on the second audit, but as I said before, the first audit from A2LA felt that they were sufficient. Then when ANAB comes in, they have a separate team of auditors. They feel that more work is needed in that area, that they were not sufficient. We welcome that finding, and as a result, we further improve those procedures to make sure people are clear. That is correct.
Okay, if commission members could turn to page 205, please.
Marvin, do you mind if I ask one question before you go ahead?
Absolutely.
The 3 different areas that Marvin just asked you about, the memo and then the other 2 statements, if I'm understanding this correctly, they all relate to the same issue with regard to the feedback you got from ANAB on the clarity of your guidance on this particular issue?
Yeah, it relates to a finding under management, which is talking about writing out clear procedures and guidelines.
It's not 3 separate areas. All of those areas you just asked about pertain to that one particular direction or guideline?
Well, they're relating to one, but then there was one question that related to the actual ratio of 4-to-1, and that's another, what's a separate finding.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you. My apologies, Marvin.
Oh, that's fine. That's fine. So on page 205, I guess it's about the fourth paragraph down after the heading investigation of non-conforming work. paragraph that starts, however, subsequent data review of all 2- and 3-person global filer mixtures tested revealed 2 separate profiles where the use of a 3-to-1 ratio resulted in the misidentification of the known major contributor profile. Do you see that, sir?
Yes.
Can you tell us what that's about? And while you're at it, you might want to read the next paragraph after it, which talks about the calculated average mixture ratios of 2-to-1 and 4-to-1.
Okay, so if you could repeat the question, sir, so we've had a read of it.
Sure. Looking at paragraph 4 that begins with the words, however, subsequent data review, could you tell us what this misidentification was that they found and how it affected you and Mr. Gettig and the people in the lab when you read this? And more importantly, Mr. Wickenheiser, going back to my original question at the very opening of my questions to you, is reading something like this on page 205, why wouldn't it have prompted a review of what you were doing in the past, as opposed to the answer you guys gave a few minutes ago that, you know, we're just satisfied with the procedures we have and that all we're really talking about here is a new sheriff is in town requesting more information from us or greater clarity. Here we're way beyond interpretation. Here we're at the point where ANAB is saying they looked at this and they found a misidentification on this 3-to-1 ratio. And by the way, if I read that paragraph correctly, Mr. Wickenheiser, and the paragraphs after it, 2 paragraphs after it, the first one beginning with the words between the calculated average and the next paragraph resulting from the ambiguity in major contributor determinations, this affects your work as it could lead to not only potentially reports that are incorrect with respect to inclusion and exclusion, but worse.
We are saying about ourselves. 3-to-1 going.
Yeah, but we're already doing a 4-to-1.
Yeah. Okay. So I believe, Mr. Schechter, I believe what you're saying is out of context. So in this particular case, right. So in this particular case, this excerpt is from our own validation documentation where we ourselves are reviewing our own work. And where we had previously used a 3-to-1 ratio, and where in our validation we found these particular issues, and we determined that we should move up to a 4-to-1 ratio because we found these very issues ourselves. So this is our corrective action where we're looking into where we've changed, improved our methods, and we ourselves are the ones saying, we found this before, this is why we're moving from 3-to-1 up to 4-to-1. So the documents you're pointing to are our own documents, our own continuous improvements, where we're stating these things that we have found and making improvements and justifying why we are moving from 3-to-1 to 4-to-1 to provide additional measure to make sure that we're making the correct allele calls. So this is really that transparency of us doing our own work.
Can I ask something just so I'm clear? Hang on, Marvin, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
You just said validation at one point. If I heard you right, you said these were our documents and you referred to validation. Are these statements that came for your documents things that you found during the validation study or things that you found when you were looking at actual casework that was done?
This is validation study. So,
all right, prior to doing casework on this, well, let me ask that. Was that validation study prior to using this to do casework?
Yes.
All right, so while you're validating it and before you do casework, this document is describing findings you made and changes that you made as a result of those findings, all before you started to do casework with this.
If I may, the validation prior that we did with IDF, the kit prior to this IDF Plus, we had data to show it was a 3-to-1 to call it major. When we did this validation, the data started indicating a 3-to-1 was not sufficient. And that's why the data indicated a 4-to-1 ratio. So that's what...
Let me just, so I'm clear, when you say when we did this validation, was that because you were moving to a different kit that you
Correct.
did that validation?
Correct, to the global
So
file.
before you did casework with that kit, did you do that validation?
Yes, we did.
And did you make these findings with regard to the validation for that kit before you did casework with
Correct.
that kit?
So every case that was done with Global Filer used a 4-to-1 ratio to characterize a major contributor.
Based on
our validation
what you're
studies.
describing here?
Yes.
All right, thank you. I was unclear and wanted to make sure I understood.
And just to further clarify, where this excerpt comes out of is a corrective action report where we are looking back and saying, what happened, and we're quoting our own validation study that was done previous to all this, and this is really an excerpt right from that validation study approved on March 8th, 2017, stating the following. So those excerpts are our justification and thought process between why we moved from 3-to-1 to 4-to-1 in this new validation.
Could I ask, when you're saying 3-to-1 or 4-to-1, you're referring to peak heights?
Correct. So how much stronger, when you have a major component, that's what you want to see, is that you see a lot more of the actual DNA from one contributor relative to the other, to a point of which when there's one that's so much more than the other, you can unambiguously select them out. That's what we're trying to do, is say when one does not overlap with another.
So hypothetically, a two-person mixture, let's say a mixture of blood at a crime scene, if you analyze that now and the ratio of the major donor is 3-to-1 as opposed to 4-to-1, is your lab going to call that inconclusive?
We would be much more conservative in how we interpret it. So well, depending on the overall mixture.
Into courtroom testimony as to conservative.
Well, depending on the mixture, it very much depends on the mixture in its entirety. We may be inconclusive because we can't separate it out. We might use, and I could refer to.
Let's say in my hypothetical, it works out perfectly, 3-to-1. You have 3 times the peak heights, apparently, for one donor, and the other donor being lower, 1/3 of the major donor. That translates into what in a courtroom?
If it was a two-person mixture?
The two-person mixture, the ratio is done at each locus. So we have 21 loci that we evaluate. So the ratio may fluctuate between the different loci, but as long as, the ones that are above 4-to-1, we can call that as a major contributor. And if we have 8 loci, a minimum of 8, usually we have much more, we can call that as a major contributor. Basically, we're restricting that two-person to a major contributor and then a minor contributor.
What if they were all 3-to-1?
But if they were all 3-to-1, we would not call that, because our protocol states it has to be at least 4-to-1 at 8. If they were all at 3-to-1, we could not call a major contributor.
Okay, well, that's my question. So if it works out across the board, 42, hypothetically 42 alleles are all, you said 21 loci, right?
21 loci, right.
So if it hypothetically works out 3-to-1 across the board, you're going to call that inconclusive. We just can't determine the major contributor, the minor contributor.
We cannot call a major contributor in that mixture.
Or you can't call anything. You're just going to tell the DA nothing we can do.
Well, again, if it's just a two-person mixture, there's other protocols that we have where we can actually, depending upon the contributors, like if it's a sexual assault case, and there's a female victim, we know it's there, we can use that to help deconvolute that. So we still may be able to say something about that profile and use what's called a likelihood ratio to describe the donors to that particular two-person mixture, if it's a two-person mixture.
Okay. This
So
might
it's
be
not
the time.
inconclusive.
So it's not inconclusive?
It would depend on. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
It would
Go ahead.
it would depend on the specific two-person mixture that you were talking about.
I got to tell you, Mike, I'm just completely befuddled here. We can't get an answer, and I'm really confused because the question that Bill Fitzpatrick asked is from the prosecution side. It's the same question I would be asking on the defense side. And this is a forensic science commission, and Mr. Wickenheiser is in a forensic science lab. So you guys know, and I asked you to tell me about that memo. You were able to explain that you understood what exclusion meant, inclusion and inconclusivity. And my question is the same as Mr. Fitzpatrick's. You have a two-person mixture. It's 3-1 across the board. If I put you on the witness stand, sir, and say to you, is this exclude my client? Does it include my client? Or is it inconclusive? What is your response?
Let me just say this. I appreciate your passion, Marvin. You know, to me, it appears that they're trying to answer questions, and if it's not clear to anyone, I understand that too. But rather than disparage people, let's just continue to ask them questions to try and clarify. And I think it's a valid question. Can you answer it?
Yeah.
Well, first of all, your original premise, when you don't have a known sample and you're talking about including, excluding, you don't have a full question there that can be answered with a very simple, and we were the ones that had to say it's a two-person mixture. This is very dependent on what the mixture is, what the known sample is, and certainly it's very easy to exclude someone in a known sample and they're not included across that profile. Very easy to have an exclusion. And then if you have all the alleles that are included, if you have a known sample, this depends on the context of whether it's an intimate sample, and whether you can use a known sample to help you with a deconvolution. It depends on all the premises of what you have, and when you have that in a case, you have all that detail. If you ask a theoretical question that's very open-ended without those details, we need those details to give you a definitive answer.
Mr. Wickenheiser, I still go back to where I am. I'm an attorney. I'm either a DA or a defense attorney. I read reports from your lab, and I'm trying to prepare a case. I'm trying to hire experts to interpret your work, or the district attorney is trying to figure out what it is that you can do to help his case, as he rightly should. And your response seems to be that you need more details from me, the defense attorney, or from the DA? I'm not quite sure I'm getting this.
Well, what I'm referring to is if you have a case, all those details, we have them all. We have who the suspect is, we have their known profile, and we have the context of the case. All of those are answered in the context of that case. When you ask a question that's a very partial question without all of that detail, then you expect concrete answers without giving us all that detail. That's why we can't answer a question that you haven't provided all of that. It's provided in a case. We can then give you those answers. When you ask us a question that isn't complete with those details, and then you expect an answer where you haven't asked a complete question, you have to ask all of those things, and you have them in any case that goes before the court.
And let me stop it. Again, in fairness to Marvin, I'm not so sure not asking the complete question is the issue. I think the issue, if I understand what everyone is saying here, is that you're saying that in a case you have all of the data, you have all the information in front of you. In the context of the questions that are being asked to you, you don't have a concrete case with all of the information in front of you that would allow you to give an opinion or to answer questions to how you would testify. That basically you would need a sample case in front of you in order to answer a question about how you would testify in that case, as opposed to the limited amount of information that's been given to you in the questions that you're being asked. Is that?
That is correct, and thank you for that clarification.
Could I?
I just want to. I'm sorry.
On page 199, there's a reference to conditional match probability, likelihood ratio, combined probability of inclusion. And I've also heard scientists use random match probability. What are the differences between the four?
The conditional match probability, which is very similar to the RMP that you mentioned, has to do with the probability when you have a single source profile. So if you have a profile that's just one person, it's a single source, okay? Or if it's a profile that you can call a major contributor, which in effect is you're restricting that to one person, you can do the conditional match probability. Okay.
X number of the population has these alleles at this locus, and then you multiply it out multiple times.
Correct.
And
you have a probability of the
conditional match probability is synonymous with random match probability.
It's very similar, yes.
All right. Likelihood ratio, it deals with mixtures.
Right.
And then combined probability of inclusion is what?
It's also mixtures, but it's a much lower stat because it doesn't take into consideration the number of contributors. It just has what alleles are there. Okay, and what the probability of inclusion, there's also a CPE or exclusion would be. But it's a very generalized, it's probably, I mean, I would say conditional match is kind of the best stat, or RMP is the best stat you can do. All right, a likelihood ratio is the next. Okay, it'll give you a likelihood with, say, two persons. And then if you do probabilistic genotyping, you can also get, convolution of even 3 and 4 person mixtures. But you can't do that with the binary system, which what we're using now. And then the CPI is, again, a lower level, which we use for this restricted approach. The restricted is the interpretation of, say, a 3-person mixture where we restrict it to essentially 2 people significantly above low-level alleles. And then from that, if we have an inclusion to that restricted portion, then we do a CPI on
that. Was ANAB's concern that some of the analysts were not familiar with these terms and procedures and probabilities?
No, I think the only thing that I'm aware of from their findings, and in the limited amount of time I had in discussing it with them, it was the restricted approach that they had difficulty with.
Yeah, I'll add to that because quality manager Dave Polkowski and I had the conversations with Nita Boltz, who was the lead auditor, and through interviews and particularly the use of the macro tool, they just felt that the people were not as consistent enough and didn't understand. And this is only the restricted CPI technique.
I don't know if you can answer this. Did ANAB think that they were overstating or understating or somewhere in the middle or both?
They didn't go any further in terms of, they just felt that we needed more detail with respect to that particular technique when people were calling inconclusive, when they were not.
Okay, and then just piggybacking over to page 198. For evidence samples consisting of a single source or a major contributor to a mixture with 8 or more loci, et cetera, when you say 8 or more loci, that's out of 21, Russ?
Yes, 21
and
STR.
Do you need, assuming it's not homozygous, do you need both alleles at 8 loci? In other words, you need 16 alleles?
If it was heterozygous at those loci, yes, you would need both of them.
Okay. And so if you had a single source, drop of blood at a crime scene, and you had a match at 7 loci, and for reasons of degradation or other problems, the other 14 were not inconsistent with your suspect, but were just not readable, you would call that inconclusive?
We'd call that not suitable for comparison purposes.
Not suitable for comparison purposes, all right. In reality, though, if you used random match probability or CMP, you would have a significant number, wouldn't you?
Are you talking now about a major contributor?
Yes, or a single source.
Okay. I mean, a single source that has less than 8, okay, we say it's insufficient for comparison purposes. And these are based on our validation studies and what we're confident in at levels that 8 loci is what our limit, what our limit is, what our threshold level.
I'm not arguing with you. I want to be clear so I can explain this to my colleagues. If you have, as said, in my hypothetical might be absurd, I don't know, but if you get 14 loci at 14 alleles at 7 different loci, that is labeled as inconclusive.
No, it's labeled as insufficient for comparison purposes.
Okay, well, to me, that's the same thing. I mean, but in reality, to me, if I did random match probability, X percentage at TPOX have this allele, and I went down the line 7 times, I'd get a number maybe in the millions, wouldn't I?
Right, and in our validation studies, we've determined that we don't want to go that low. So we're being very conservative in our calls with partial profiles.
Okay. And then in 2, for a mixture profile, you up the number to 12.
Correct.
Okay. And seeing, I think there are 4 of us in the room being sued by Mr. Hillary, so I don't want to concentrate on the case, but you know my consternation with that particular case. I had fingernail scrapings that obviously every time you have fingernail scrapings, you're going to have a mixture. And the major donor is going to be the person that owns those fingernails, unless somebody gouges somebody's face off or something. So when the when the victim was excluded with that, I had 11 identifiable alleles left. Under current protocols, is it still the lab's position that that is meaningless? That could mean 11 different donors, that the kid had 11 different donors under his fingernails, and that the 11 alleles, all of which matched the suspect, were of no evidentiary value.
Well, the profile I think you're referring to from the fingernails had a major contributor and then a very low level profile with dropout.
No question about it. Very, very low level.
And it was below what we call the stochastic threshold, meaning that we don't know if we have dropout, we don't know if we're seeing everything. So therefore, we do not interpret that.
All right, one last thing. I don't know if you can talk to counsel. When you have turnover in your lab, but when somebody does an exam in your lab and leaves, there ought to be something in their contract that they are required to testify as to what they did after they leave the New York State Police lab.
Let me ask that as a question. Do you know whether or not there's anything in your regulations or your procedures or your contracts with people that require them to follow through on analysis or work that they do while they're working in the lab?
I will check, but I'm pretty sure we do not, and we're not in a position that we can compel someone. Certainly there's generally goodwill across crime labs that people will come back to testify, but I do not think we can compel people to do so through any employment contract.
All right.
But I will check on that.
Is that a union or
I believe
contract
that's a
issue?
union. I believe that's a union issue.
Thank you.
But I will check on it.
Thank you, Ray, and thanks, Russell.
Marvin, did you have other?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to pages 204 and 205. Mr. Wickenheiser, on page 204, at the bottom of the page, the last 2 paragraphs, one of which is one line, says, under nonconformity resolution, the following information was provided. And then it quotes the global filer validation study included a mixture study comprised of a series of 2- and 3-person mixtures in varying ratios. Goes on to say what the mixture study determined the ratios to which a single major contributor could be deduced. Laboratory policy as defined in the validation study is that a 4-to-1 ratio will be used to deduce a major contributor. And then ANAB says, however, the validation does not conclusively support this decision. The rest of the page on 205 that I quoted for is what your response is to that, how you arrived at the 4-to-1, your work?
No.
Is that correct?
No, it's not. This entire document, the entire document referring to is our own writing. So this is our writing of the whole, background to the scenario. We've got various things like root cause analysis. Here's what we're going to do about it. That particular sentence, however, the validation, this is us essentially restating what ANAB had for their finding. Then we're providing our own investigation to say, what did we see? Here's the background, and then eventually what we're going to do about it, which is to run some additional samples in that 4-to-1 ratio to provide a supplemental validation. So what you're reading from is all of our own investigation into this, how we're going to come around to how we're going to address what they saw, and how we're going to shore that up with additional testing. And then all of that was in turn accepted by ANAB as being sufficient, and our own testing has then borne that out, of which we will then reply and provide all of that information. So at this point, all of that has been accepted by ANAB as appropriate, and then when we complete it, we will then turn in that documentation to them and then have it accepted, assuming that it is, in fact, appropriate.
Correct. Let me turn to page 210. Pages 211 of the commission book, and ask you, Mr. Wickenheiser, if you could address the third paragraph on the page with respect to the identification of major contributor profiles in mixed DNA samples. And tell us what that paragraph means.
Okay, so that's the big one where we go through all the different ratios.
Right.
What this is essentially what we're going to do to add sufficiently complex mixtures in order to demonstrate that when we are going to apply it to casework, we have done all those same kinds of tests in the lab, so that when another auditing team comes out and looks and says, you really need to do more of that, this is our response to say, here's all the mixtures we're going to set up. So you see in there 4 to 4 to 1, 5 to 5 to 1, 6 to 6 to 1, separate sets of 4-person mixtures in a 4 to 4 to 1, 5. So these are all the ratios that we propose. And all of these in turn, this entire paragraph outlines how we're going to address and how we're going to meet that concern that ANAB auditors had. This in turn has gone back to them, where the lead auditor has in turn reviewed it with their auditing team, and they have accepted that as being sufficient to answer their concerns. So we've carried out those tests. The data looks good, and we will in turn come up with some essentially conclusions and a supplemental, some statements, and a little bit of a report just to add to our current validation.
Let me ask you just a general question based upon all of the 50 pages that we've got today with respect to ANAB and your agency. Currently, with respect to 2-person mixtures and 3-person mixtures, what are the parameters for reporting something as inconclusive? What constitutes inconclusive on a 2-person mixture and on a 3-person mixture? And the reason I'm asking is because my read of these 50 pages is that what's happened here is that it's clear what an exclusion is, and it's pretty clear what an inclusion is, but the middle one, the insufficiency or inconclusiveness, and I'm not sure those two terms can be used interchangeably, that category has expanded. And from a perspective in a court of law, both the prosecution and the defense probably would not be comfortable, given the circumstances of a particular case, with that particular finding. So for us in the courtroom, inconclusive is a real problem. So I'm trying to hone in on where you are today after all of this ANAB audit and all of the things that you say you've done in the validation and making things clearer. On a two-person mixture, what constitutes inconclusive? And the same for the three-person mixture.
Okay, so first I'm going to answer that in general terms, and I'll refer to Dr. Gettig. So part of what we do is in our validations, we're trying to find out where we have issues and where we have firm ground. And I think this is probably fairly universal for all labs doing mixtures. When we first sort of ventured out to do mixtures, we're probably more confident perhaps than as the mixtures got more and more complex. We recognized that we had degradation issues, dropout issues where we're not seeing all of the profiles, stochastic effects, things to the point at which we became more and more conservative, as in we needed to see stronger and stronger profiles in order to make the call, so to speak, so that more things began to fall in the inconclusive range. And like originally there was a single threshold, then a second threshold came in to account for stochastic effects. So in general terms, more profiles have begun or have been moved into that inconclusive or not sufficient for comparison range. Now, I'll refer to Dr. Gettig to answer more specifically when things are called inconclusive.
Yeah, and we distinguish between saying insufficient for comparison purposes or not suitable for comparison purposes. That is different from being inconclusive.
In what way?
Inconclusive in that the profile, if it's not suitable, it means it's either very low level, it's degraded, it's genetically complex. We can't, with our protocols, with our current binary system, we cannot do anything with it. So we're not saying the person is there or the person is not there. We're just saying we can't make any determination whatsoever.
And I think just to add, if I could just add to what Dr. Gettig is saying, this is why labs are moving to probabilistic genotyping, because all of these techniques that we have, and you can see we use a variety of statistical techniques depending on the mixture. We're always going to use the best tool or the one that gives you the most associative value. And we recognize that there are mixtures that are low level that are better handled by a probabilistic genotyping program where we in the lab with a binary system have to err on the side of conservatism. We give the error, so to speak, to the defendant by not making a call where you very well may see that there appears to be a bit of a profile in there, but based on our validation, we are going to be conservative, whereas a probabilistic genotyping program may very well be able to arrive at a statistic that we in the lab with tools that are not as discriminating cannot. And so you're seeing the difference between different applications of different tools, different statistical techniques, which is the reason why many labs are moving towards probabilistic genotype.
Can I please interject for one moment? So Ray, so if I'm hearing you correctly, are you saying that even though a mixture may be inconclusive as a standalone result, that doesn't preclude it then being compared to a known sample using something such as probabilistic genotyping?
That is exactly correct, that we may, using our tools, older techniques, statistical techniques that we acknowledge have limitations, we can only use those tools within the limits of what they can be used for. But we recognize that another lab, or for that matter, even our lab with a better tool, like probabilistic genotyping that's more discriminating, may now arrive at a statistic where a previously less discriminating tool like CPI being used conservatively, would not arrive at a statistic.
I just want to hopefully maybe alleviate some of the concerns by some of my co-members that I don't think that the lab is saying that they can't use the profile at all or the results at all. It's just that there's a limitation of how much they can say as a standalone result, but that if they do have known samples that they can use for comparison, that they could employ something such as probabilistic genotyping to give an answer, so that it's not just saying we can't do we're throwing up our hands and we can't do anything with it at all.
Is that correct?
Is that correct?
So I guess just to add to that, so given that we are not using probabilistic genotyping at this point, there are going to be mixtures where we do have to say that we're inconclusive or there is insufficient data. However, that could be sent to a third-party lab, which has occurred in cases where another lab that has validated and has approved probabilistic genotyping. It would be could be appropriate for them to do that. And the same mixture, which cannot be interpreted with one older technique using statistics, could very well be validly done with a new technique, which would be probabilistic genotyping.
So if in reading, the corrective action tracking report, it does appear that you did bring on 3 new techniques at essentially the same time. So I can understand why you didn't bring on the probabilistic genotyping as well. So is it on your radar for being validated sometime this year or in the near future?
We're currently in the process of, we're required to generate a request for proposals on RFP. So that has to go through our finance department, and we're well along the way right now. We're hoping to be able to issue this RFP sometime in May. And then we'll get bids back and evaluate the bids and then select a ProbGen system that then we would then validate.
Let me do this. I hate to do this, but let's take just a 5-minute break and be back. I think we're at hopefully a good breaking point. So just 5 minutes and we'll be back.
So that'll be at least a year from today.
By the time we validate it, yeah.
Training.
Yeah.
Record. Thank you, everyone, for your indulgence. Marvin, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Before there was a spate of questions, Dr. Gettig, you were explaining the difference between insufficient and inconclusive. You explained insufficient. Could you please give us the definition currently of inconclusive?
Inconclusive would be in a situation where when we have something that we could say for comparison. Let's say, for example, the 3-person mixture we were talking about. And we restrict and we have 12 locations, 12 loci that we can use for comparison. Now we compare with our reference sample and we find out that, oh, well, one of them is inconclusive, meaning that it's not in the restricted portion, it's in the whole profile, but not in the restricted portion. Drops down to 11, okay? That means that, well, the 11 may still be suitable and identical with the reference source, but we cannot do any weight based on our protocols. So we can't give it a weight. We can't do a stat on it. If we can't give it a weight or a stat, we can't make an inclusion. But we're not going to exclude that person. So that's what we mean by inconclusive.
And Mr. Wickenheiser, I just want to be sure I understand your side of this, which is the fact that you go to inconclusive represents the desire of your agency to be conservative before you call it an inclusion. Is that correct?
Certainly we're not going to overstate in any way the evidence and what our validation studies say are solid. So if it doesn't meet the bar, but we still have information that is not exculpatory, we certainly aren't going to exclude that person, but we're not going to state an inclusion either. Hence, we have these 2 options.
2 last questions, Mr. Wickenheiser. Is it your recommendation to this commission that the way to go in the future is to abandon these 3 methods, random match, CPI, and the other one, likelihood ratio, and go to probabilistic genotyping? Is that the answer?
No, not entirely. I think that it's another tool that should be applied to cases that labs will have to evaluate. There's going to be situations where there's a strong and easily deduced mixture that there's no need to go to a probabilistic model, and then there's going to be very complex mixtures that would be best suited. So it very much depends on the context of the case.
Okay.
So probabilistic genotyping is expressed in terms of likelihood ratio.
Typically, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I don't know if Marvin meant to ask that way.
Right. And let me ask you this, Mr. Wickenheiser. Do you have written protocols currently in your lab for CPI, inconclusive, insufficient? Do you have protocols for those?
Yes. Yes, we do.
Yes. And I might remark, if I could just add, that this particular finding that you're referring to is not on any of our procedures. The finding is in the management, as in how the procedures are written, do you get understanding. So there was no technical finding that our procedures are not adequate. Our procedures are adequate. This is on the understanding of the personnel.
Let me go back to my question about the protocol.
No. You said two. That was two questions. Judge.
I asked about protocols, and he asked
two simple questions.
Well, now I got a complex one.
I'll exercise my discretion
Since you
and let him
decided
ask
to tell me
another
about
question.
management and procedures, tell me a little bit. You do have written protocols, correct, for what I asked?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Is it possible for us on the commission to see those protocols? I think it would be very helpful for us, because it might be very helpful for us if we're evaluating other laboratories in the future with respect to nonconformities in these areas. After all, you're one of the biggest labs, the state police.
It'd be very helpful, especially when Marvin is cross-examining one of your experts.
That would be even more helpful.
It would be wonderful.
Well, can we get those? They're not secret, are they?
If the commission wishes that we provide those procedures, we can provide them. Yes.
That's a good answer, Mr. Wickenhauser. The last time one of the commissioners asked for this kind of thing, he got shot down 7-0. So I'll ask, expecting the usual response. Can we get those, Michael?
Specifically, what is it that you're asking for, Marvin?
The protocols used by the New York State Police Lab for determining the use of CPI and its interpretation, and how what are the protocols for calling something an exclusion, an inclusion, and inconclusive?
And from the laboratory's perspective, is there any reason that you have why you do not want those protocols made public or provided to Marvin, or for that matter, the rest of the commission members?
Yeah, don't use me, Michael.
Do you want? Let me ask you this: is that something you want time to consider with counsel and respond to?
We probably refer to our own counsel just to make sure we're on solid ground.
So for the next meeting, or prior to the next meeting in writing, if you can you provide me with the New York State Police position on that request so that the commission can consider it? And then we'll add this to the agenda for the next meeting to consider that, if that's okay, Marvin.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything further? All right, thank you. Appreciate it, gentlemen.
Moving along, the next item on the agenda is the DCGS Lake Print Laboratory. It's on your binders, page 224 to 227, and there's members of that laboratory here. Should there be any questions? Okay.
I'm sorry, does someone have a question?
No.
Okay. Next laboratory on the agenda under accreditation updates is the Niagara County Sheriff's Department. That's in your books between pages 228 and 232. And an additional material is provided this morning, 223.1. It's in the blueprint, and 220 up to 223.6. And members of that laboratory are available if there's any questions.
Yes, I have a question or two.
Okay, just, if you give us a moment, we'll get them on the phone.
Okay.
What page are you going to go to?
This isn't a question for them, but in looking at some of these reports, some will say nonconformity, and then it'll in parentheses say minor versus recommended versus major, and
We do have someone from ANAB here, so
Good morning,
we
Corey.
probably
This is
ask.
Shelley at the commission meeting. Would
Maybe
the
after
commissioners like
this.
to speak with you? She put me on hold. Corey?
Hello?
Hello?
Sorry, there was a problem with the phone. Hello?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Who are we speaking with?
This is Corey Gari, the laboratory director.
Well, thank you for joining us, and we do have a question. We're in two different places. There's some commissioners in Albany, there's some commissioners in New York, so I hope the technology works properly here, but we have a question from New York.
Okay.
Hi. I was counting the number of nonconformities. Did I count 12?
Nope, there were 7.
7. Okay. And so the packet that we received today, I was wondering in our original packet that there had been no plans, but now what we've received today are your plans for answering all of the 7 nonconformities?
That is correct.
Okay. So that had been my concern, that I didn't see any plans. So thank you for submitting the supplemental paperwork. I have 8.
And just for clarification, their assessment was this past February, so they're still within the normal time frame to get that, because there's a period of time for the laboratory to assess the finding, come up with the appropriate corrective action, and then look at implementing that. So this is within that timeline. It just their inspection or assessment happened at an awkward time in timing of this meeting.
Okay, thank you, Brian. That's the only questions I had.
Okay. If there's no one else, thank you very much, Niagara County. The next laboratory in the agenda is the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory, and there was a request from the commission. There's a document in the binders from 233 to 238 in response to that request, and there's also a different document on 239 to 240. So pertaining to this section, 233 to 240 would be the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory, and there's members of that laboratory available if you'd like to discuss it. Anyone? Okay. The last item under accreditation updates is the 2017 annual lab summaries. They're found on page 241 to 281. This is one of the things that the New York labs have to do to maintain compliance. It's a routine document the Commission normally sees this time of year. So again, pages 241 to 281.
I have a question. Pages
Yes, Marvin.
241 to 281. Does this represent everything that the labs did in the past year in their contact with the commission? And is this all the labs or just the labs that showed up? Because it seems awfully thin.
No, it's all the laboratories under the jurisdiction of the commission. And what's happened is this is all the significant stuff that's come through. So a lot of what happened is in the past there was a lot of conversations that would be included of, we have an assessment coming up, what hotel would the inspector like to stay at, what's the price going back and forth. So some of that information has been not included on this. So the things that are included on this document are only the things that are significant toward their accreditation.
Okay.
If there's no further questions, that concludes that section of the agenda, and back to number 5, old business.
All right, so under old business, the first matter we have under letter A deals with our ongoing review of the accreditation bodies available and that we use. At this point, I think we've received correspondence from and heard from A2LA. We've heard from ANAB. We've heard from ABFT. And my recollection is that ABFT indicated that they will be, I don't know if merging is the right word, but in some fashion joining with ANAB by 2020, which I think at least in some regard narrows the scope of our decision-making. But I guess at this point what I do is open the floor for discussion in terms of whether or not anyone has any comments, thoughts, or discussion in terms of what direction we should go in as a commission moving forward.
So I just have a general comment based on the section that we just went over with lab updates and accreditation, that I have felt that the reviews and comments that have been submitted to the laboratories by ANAB appear to show that they are timely in their oversight, and they are, when they've noticed that there's been something that could be improved, that they've made suggestions for improvement. On the surface, I don't have any real reservations about their ability to continue to be an oversight department or company for the accreditation purposes of our laboratories. So any reservations that we may have about specific areas that we felt that maybe they may have gone back on or maybe lightened up as far as criteria or protocols, I got the impression that they would work with us if there was something that we felt still needed to be strengthened or placed back with the same strength that we had felt was present previously. So that's just my general comments. I don't have any real problem with ANAB and what they've done since they've taken over for ASCLD.
One general comment I would have is that in the December 14th, 2015 meeting, I believe, when this initial started, there are different levels of the international standard. There's 17025, which is the standard for testing and calibration, and there's 17020, which is the standard for inspection bodies. And I think there was still necessarily a debate that necessarily wasn't clear in the regs, because when the regs were written, it was before the international standard came out. So it might be worth just having a discussion, if everyone feels appropriate to do that, about which of those two we would go for. I can express my personal opinion that for disciplines like crime scene, I think 17020 is acceptable. However, for disciplines where an identification is made, like latent prints or firearms, I would prefer that the international standard associated with testing and calibration is used. So they're both international standards, and now you're in a place where there's multiple bodies that offer multiple levels of accreditation. Even if we don't finalize which body we go with, I think it would be worthwhile to maybe have a discussion about what level we go with.
Brian, were they planning to change from 17025?
Currently, if you look, previously ASCLD Lab, in their previous entity, had their legacy program, which was one that was self-contained. When they moved to the international standard, they moved towards 17025 and didn't offer a 17020 program. Now that it's now an amalgam with ANAB offers a 17020 program, and I believe A2LA also offers a 17020 program. So both of these bodies that we'd be considering, even if there's no final determination on that now, offer accreditation from each of those levels.
Let me ask a question to clarify. Do I remember correctly that ABFT indicated that by 2020, when they somehow join forces with ANAB, that it will all be the 17025 standard at that point?
That's correct.
All right, so the concern or the issue you're raising, if we decide to stay with ANAB exclusively, right, ANAB, ABFT, won't be a concern after 2020, correct? That everyone would have to meet that 17025 standard anyhow. All right. And then the other, well, there's a couple other things I had, but one was, again, if I remember, I was going to say, Scott, hang on. I was going to ask you next, is my recollection is that one of the things that we asked was that you check and get us feedback from laboratory directors with regard to this issue.
Yes, so I have some feedback. The laboratory directors and the toxicology technical working group had a conference call a few weeks ago to discuss what you'd asked me to look at about ABFT and ANAB. So some of the discussion regarded was there were crosswalk documents that were going to explain how ABFT and ANAB were going to be integrated. So a lot of the lab directors felt they couldn't give me a full response on that until they have a time to review those crosswalk documents that are supposed to be published within the next month or two. So the partial answer, though, that I was able to get some information from them was that, as stated by Dr. Graham, by 2020, as you stated, that was the date that the laboratories that are currently under ABFT would have to fall under ANAB ABFT. But there was an email sent to Dr. Graham for further clarification, and the question was, is for those labs that are scheduled to be inspected in 2020, is it correct we can choose to be only ABFT inspected at that time and work on ISO by our 2022 inspection? And his answer, this is quoting him again, is short answer, yes. If you are scheduled for July 2020 reaccreditation, you will be allowed to earn that reaccreditation and it will be valid through June 30th, 2022. Assuming the Commission allows that, but it was my understanding from the last meeting that they would allow that, end quotes. So just in regards to the 2020 deadline, there does seem to be some flexibility in regards to what that deadline is. There was also some comment, there are, I believe, 9 laboratories that conduct toxicology work. 7 of those laboratories are currently under ABFT. They are unanimous at this point that they would want to continue to have the 17025, the ANAB standards and the ABFT standards moving forward. The other 2 laboratories are still reviewing if that's something they want to move forward with, or will they just continue with 17025 and the ANAB standards, or does the Commission have an opinion on that? So I don't have a complete answer, but that's as much as I've got at the moment.
And, maybe one thing, I don't know if you can shed any light on this for me or not, but I'm not clear on what, once you go to the 17025 standard, I'm having a hard time understanding what the ABFT standard would add to that if we said, because if I understand you right, some labs are saying, if we stick with NAB, we want the 17025 standard, plus we want the ABFT standard. And what I'm struggling to understand is what the ABFT standard adds to the 17025 standard. I don't know if you can shed any light on that.
I'd like to shed some light, but if there is a toxicology lab director in the room, maybe they could shed some light. But from my understanding, the 7 lab directors who are ABFT accredited think it elevates the current 17025 because it becomes discipline specific, like the DNA QAS documents the FBI has them do for DNA testing. But I defer to them if there's someone present.
So Christine Giffen is approaching the table. She's also the chair of the toxicology working group. So she's familiar with the discussions that were on this area.
Yes.
Go ahead.
We do feel that there's value in the ABFT. One of the things I would like to point out to all of the commission members is that I'm kind of an outsider to ABFT. I came into it when I accepted this lab director position. I was an ISO only 17025 lab in my previous job. And it took me a little while to understand the difference between ABFT and ANAB and the ISO standard. The ISO standard is very, very valuable. It just concerns the paperwork and that type of aspect, whereas ABFT focuses on the discipline of toxicology. Are you providing the best possible answer for your clients for toxicology-related matters? They look at the way that you're doing your processes and the way that you are performing your analysis to make sure that you are doing the best possible job that you possibly can. So they're looking at the science, and that's really the main difference between the ISO and the ABFT standard.
So if you put the standards side by side and you took the 17025 standards that ANAB uses and put them here, and you took the standards that ABFT uses and put them here, are there written standards that you would see in the ABFT standards that they use to evaluate you that would not be in the 17025 standards?
Some of the labs have started to do that. However, we do feel that there was some missing information. For instance, ABFT specifies the whole set of proficiencies that you're required to do. They come in and make sure that you're doing all of the proficiencies that's acceptable, that is covering all of the casework that you are doing. So there are specific standards. I think one of the challenges of ABFT is because they are not paperwork specific, that they don't necessarily convey some of the intent behind some of their checklist standards as well as they possibly could. And I think that's one of the challenges that I had coming in. When they come to inspect you, they're looking deeper, if that makes any sense, than just what's written on paper.
No, it does make sense, but I guess what I'm wrestling with is by 2020, ABFT and ANAB are going to be one and the same, as I understand it.
By the end of 2020, that is correct.
So once we get to 2020, what I'm wrestling with is, one course of action, assuming the commission decides to stay with NAB, is to say 2020, once these two entities somehow become one, and the 17025 is the standard that one entity uses, I'm struggling to understand what the addition of saying we also want the ABFT standard, if the difference is the look and feel of ABFT. Is that going to be gone when the two merge? If that's the difference that you appreciate and want, once they become one entity, I'm struggling to understand how that continues to exist.
And Mike, if I could just add one little point, and maybe just using Christine's example about proficiency testing. So currently, understanding they're evolving and moving toward the 17025 standard. So ABFT does specify that they have to do CAP, College of American Pathology tests that go through. So while the words within the ANAB, the 17025 standards are not sometimes as specific, sometimes I find they're like levels of an onion. So with that example, what they say is you have to use a accredited proficiency test provider. So if you look back and compare it to ABFT right now, CAP is not an accredited provider. So one of the problems is being an accredited provider, you have to have a mechanism to accept feedback. So the toxicology labs in the state have had a lot of problems with CAP over the years because samples are not working as they should. So they have no mechanism to provide feedback. So there are different ways of looking at the same thing. What I would encourage is to give the Tox Lab time to kind of look at it. But I think if you come up with a matrix, and my office can send some stuff that we've preliminarily done as a starting point to help them, because I know they're all very busy. But I think if you actually start spelling it out and start looking at what one has and what the other has, while there's not as many words and they look more management related, when you actually spell them out, things about validation, things about uncertainty, they're actually like spider webs, they come out very quickly and they encompass a lot more. So I think it would just behoove the Tox Lab to kind of look at them side by side. My feeling is if they want to keep using it, they're welcome to. I don't know if I'd feel comfortable mandating it because I would want to see that there's an added value. From my preliminary look, the one thing I saw that was distinctly different is the qualifications of a lab director between the two. That's something distinctly different. But again, I think a further discussion with that group would be worthwhile to see. But as I said, if they want to, and again, I know someone from NAB is here right now if they want to discuss that process, but they talked about maybe like maybe instead of like a truncated or combined inspection process for both. So again, the crosswalk would be helpful, but I think it's still at the early stages. I don't know if that helps.
Sure, no, it does.
Well, we are. I apologize.
No, don't apologize.
We're struggling with the 2020 deadline. So that's one of the reasons I had reached out to Dr. Jones regarding whether we had to be ISO by the 2020 deadline. And that's one of the clarifications we need from this body because, you know, I am a relatively small lab. There's a total of 9 of us. And we have a lot going on with not just casework, but we're implementing a new LIMS system, and we're also undergoing laboratory construction and trying to keep up with casework as well. To dedicate to asking us to essentially go towards documents that don't yet exist, and now I understand may not exist until June. And also, it's my understanding, based on my conversations with another lab directors, that you're supposed to be operating as ISO for a year prior to applying as a new lab for the ANAB. That would essentially mean that I would have to be by June of 2019, and it's quite frankly not possible.
There's one added complexity. Sorry to interrupt.
No, feel.
So currently, the ISO IEC 17025 standard was put out in 2005. It has subsequently been updated to a 2017 edition. So what that means is when they're looking to come, and we looked and we spelled it out for the tox labs, either 2020 or 2022, they have to now also comply with the new standard from ISO, which is significantly different than the old one. So even if they look to partner with a lab that's already had this, they get some insight, but it's very different. So they do have a very heavy lift in a very short period of time. But the concern I have, based on the deadline essentially that ABFT provided with that short timeline, is if you don't do that, that means you just say those labs are not accredited because there's nobody else to do it. So it's challenging. You know, what I've been trying to do is our office bought the standards for the tox labs. We've been facilitating conference calls to try and get it going. But I'm not sure I'm very comfortable just saying that there's a moratorium on accreditation for a period of time. So I don't know what the solution necessarily is.
So, Brian, excuse me, Brian. Yeah, well, there was a long overlap between the time when laboratories under ASCLD Lab could be legacy before they switched over to ISO. So why wouldn't we be asking for the same sort of flexibility in this?
That's an excellent question, but it's not flexibility on our part. It's flexibility on ABFT's part, because essentially they're shutting the doors on 2020. So since they're not there, there's nowhere to go to for them. They are not providing that service anymore. And, you know, again, we can try and have broader discussions with ANAB, and I don't know that there's other states that have this challenge. I believe approximately 35 labs or 38 labs are accredited nationwide under the ABFT program. 8 of them are in New York, so it's a significant market share. And New York is one of the few states that mandates accreditation by an external body. So if it's not ABFT, because that's off the table, who is it? And it can't be ANAB with the 17025 because they're not there yet. So the question is, the gap in between there, I think, is a dangerous gap. And I think it's something worthy of discussing.
Christine?
Yes.
I'm looking at the email you sent me from Dr. Jones. I said Dr. Graham, sorry. But Dr. Jones has stated that, that if some labs are being inspected in 2020, they could choose to be only ABFT. Would you happen to know, is that the majority of the labs, or that's just a few labs?
We're actually split down the middle, Scott. So some are on 1 year. Yeah. Yes.
So, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I was just going to say, but Brian, do you think then, if we reached out to ABFT and said, could we have all the labs assessed on 2020, assuming all the lab directors feel that's appropriate, but that means we get another 2 years into 2022?
Pam Steele is in the room from ANAB, and she might not be ready to talk to this, and I apologize for throwing you under the bus, but maybe if you could just approach the table and discuss, and you don't have to have a final solution, but understanding the challenge that we're all encountering, because ultimately we're trying, the New York model is that there's an external accrediting body that's providing, the process, and there's also the New York State accreditation that happens. So we're trying to avoid that gap where nothing happens, but my understanding was that ABFT had a hard stop at a certain point where that program just wasn't going to operate.
The hard stop that ANAB and ABFT had discussed was when ANAB took over that program for them. Right now, ANAB is administering the ABFT program for them. We're putting together their assessment teams. We're doing all the paperwork behind the scenes. We're using the ABFT inspectors. The deadline that they had put in place was at the end of 2020, they would no longer be doing assessment activities, which means that program then comes to us. So we can't really run a program that's just the ABFT program moving forward, and that as a recognized accrediting body, that program would not be recognized. Right now, we're recognized by ILAC. Anything that was under that program is outside of that recognition.
And just clarifying, ILAC, for the non-accreditation speak, is the international community that recognizes accrediting bodies. So they are not able to go lower than a certain standard, or they'll have their other programs in jeopardy.
So that would be the end of 2020 you're talking?
That was the end of 2020.
So any lab that was accredited, whether it's 2019, 2020, they'd have all year 2020 to get their accreditation under the current ABFT standards. They would be accredited. It would be when they need to get their next accreditation that this issue would come up. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, it's interesting because it is a discussion that we needed to have with Dr. Jones as well, because ABFT needed to make the final decision. What does that 2020 cutoff mean? Does it mean at that point you're no longer offering accreditation, but you'll maintain the ones that exist? Or does it mean at that point the ABFT program no longer exists, and if a lab wants to be accredited, it has to be under the 17025 in conjunction with ABFT?
I did get clarification from Dr. Jones on that in writing through emails back and forth, and he said that if a laboratory had, if they were expiring right before 2020, that they would allow them to go under the ABFT program and maintain under it, but they would not accredit new programs. Now, maybe it's more of a conversation with ABFT if we can, see if we can have them stay in place, for a little bit longer. But, I understand the limitation you have where you can't, because of your own accreditation, offer a different program.
We could continue, feasibly, we could continue to administer that if that's the direction that ABFT wants to go with it, that once we hit December 31st, 2020, nobody else gets assessed or reassessed or inspected or re-inspected, as they would say in their program, under that program, then you've got the 2 more years to get everybody moved over.
Right. Let me ask this. Obviously, as you can tell from listening to the different considerations are being voiced here, we have issues in terms of how this transition is done, and we have concerns. Is ABFT willing to work with the commission, and help us come up with a way to balance those concerns and it's done in a way, that we maintain the integrity of the accreditation process, but also take into account the challenges that the tax labs face in making a transition?
Oh, yeah. ANAB. I just want, because you did say ABFT, and I don't want to speak for them, but yes, ANAB will. Yes, there's
yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if we're at my sense is, and if other commission members feel differently, let me know, but I don't think we've formally, as a commission, made a decision yet, so I don't know that we're in a position to ask you for anything more than, will you work with us? And then I think we as a commission need to make a decision, sit down with you and figure out if we can implement it the way we want to, and hopefully have all that done by our next meeting in June so that the labs have some guidance and know what they're going to do. But, the one thing, if I'm understanding correctly, that I would hope would give you a little bit of comfort is that it sounds like there will be a way that we can do this so that if people get accredited by the end of 2020, we can find a way so that you're not saying I need to be accredited by June of 19. It sounds like we'll be able to avoid that scenario.
That would be ideal.
I should clarify, accredited under a different set of standards than you are now.
I think one of our uncertainties is we don't even know what we're working towards yet. The documents, from my understanding, the ones that Brian was talking about, they haven't been published yet. They're still not going to be published until June of this year. So you're asking us to work, it's a documentation program asking us to work towards documents that don't yet exist. I keep being told, well, they're similar to what already exists. Well, I don't know if you see the irony in this, that we're being asked to look towards similar documents that are not what we're being held to. So,
if that June time frame is accurate, that will be good, because hopefully it will coincide with the next commission meeting and we'll have documentation done and available by the time we need to make a decision at that meeting.
Instead of also looking at the glass as half empty or half full, as a scientist, it's full because it's half of air and half of water. So if we move forward with that, the 17025 standard is definitely something you're going to be accredited to, and that's not changing. So that was already provided, purchased by OFS, and distributed. And I think the other advantage that New York labs have at this point is, essentially that you can work together. So I think when the transition happened from the legacy to ISO, I think the crime laboratories tended to work alone about doing it. The Tox lab process, I think, is a little bit more amenable to maybe taking pieces of things, working together and developing manuals. Not exactly, but I think, working as a collective, I think will help that process as opposed to doing everything from scratch alone. That's just my opinion. But that's, again, where being the chair of the Tox working group would really help if you can kind of foster that. And obviously, we with OFS will facilitate any web meetings or things you need to do that. I cut you off here, something
Yeah,
like
I think
that.
Pam wanted to add something.
A couple of clarifications I just want to make. There is no requirement that you be operating under 17025 for a year before you become accredited. That is not accurate. We want you to be operating under that by the time you make application, because one of the things that you have to do before you apply as part of getting ready is you're going to need to do an internal audit. So you're going to need to have some records for your own purposes to review to make sure you're conforming with the version of 17025, so that you're well prepared for the assessment. It does not have to be a year. And then the other thing is that it will not be June when those documents are released. You're talking about the new accreditation requirements documents. Those will be released. I was trying to get them out on Friday. I didn't manage to get them out on Friday. I tried like heck to get them out before this meeting because I knew it was going to come up at this meeting. So I would expect within the next week or so we're going to have those out. We're trying frantically to finish the crosswalk documents so that everybody has the information available. Not only will we be publishing the new accreditation requirement document, but then we want a document that goes from here's what the ASCLD lab accreditation requirements were, here's where that is or isn't in the new requirements, here's what the A&EB requirements were, here's where they are in the new one, here's the new AR 3028 that New York State Police was just assessed to, and where do those get shuffled and renumbered in this new document so that there's not a lot of confusion once we release it. So the only reason we haven't released it yet is because we know as soon as we do, we're going to get bombarded with questions from, various different programs, and we want to kind of put people at ease at the same time when we release that so they can see how those documents correlate. And I will say it is the new 17025 is out. It's been out since November. The accreditation requirements document that will be coming out, I know you don't want to hear it, it's very similar to the set of requirements that New York State Police just underwent assessment to. And we tried very hard not to add anything, right? We took some stuff away because it's covered by the new 17025, but we were trying not to get into the weeds and create additional requirements above and beyond what we had already published, because that really wasn't the intent of what we were doing. We weren't trying to create new things. We were trying to revise the document that already existed.
Let me make two comments so I can. So first, thank you for being here And to the extent you can get those documents out well before our June meeting to give the Office of Forensic Services and anyone else who wants the time to review them so the commission can consider those at the June meeting, that would be very helpful, and we'd appreciate that. And then, secondly, I hope I speak for all the commission members, but in terms of the tox labs, we realize that there's going to be a transition. ABFT is changing. So, one way or another, things are going to have to change, and we understand the resource limitations you talk about. We appreciate those. And, obviously we have a job to do in terms of making sure that labs are operating in a way that comports with the statute and comports with good results and good science. And we understand your concerns and considerations, and we will do the best we can, to work with you to make the transition that's going to have to happen, one that's as smooth as it can possibly be without violating what we need to do. And I thank you for being here.
Thank you for hearing me.
Yeah, and we will be looking for more input. To the extent you or any of the other tax labs have things you think are important for us to consider, feel free to send them to us, and we'll circulate those to the commission. And you also would be welcome to speak at the June commission meeting as well, because this will be on the agenda again.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Anyone else? Any other commission members have anything they want? Scott.
Yeah, if you don't mind, Pam, I'm sorry. I think I asked this question at the last meeting. In regards to the 17025 standard, when do you think we will have to be in compliance with? Because of the 2017 one, is it 3 years from now, 4 years from now, 5 years from now?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Dylan, this is like a spoiler alert, right? Because I don't get to get my notification out before I answer the question for you, but I will answer the question for you. ANAB has to make sure that every one of our accredited laboratories is transitioned to the new 17025 by it's either August or November of 2020. So what that means for us is that we can't wait until 2020 to have you guys start moving, right? Because we will never get everybody done. So I will tell you right now, my staff is going to wring my neck for announcing this. Starting June 1st of 2019, every assessment activity that ANAB conducts will be to the 2017 version of 17025. So you will get an explanation of that. When we send it out, I can give you a brief explanation. It's not going to be, not everybody has to undergo reassessment. The checklists that need to be filled out right now for surveillance activity, there are certain things we have right on our website. These are the minimum requirements for these different activity types, and you go in and fill out the appropriate areas in the checklist. There will be a checklist like that for surveillance activity. You will go through and fill out the ones that are indicated that need to be done for surveillance, whether it's on-site or off-site, and we will review that, and at that point, we will transition you to the new document. So we're going to hit the high points that we think are the significant changes from the 2005 version of 17025 to the 2017 version. So it might sound like a more daunting task than it really is, but we are trying to get that in place, and that's why we've been holding off on pushing the document out so that we could have this all lined out and laboratories can understand what their options are moving forward.
So just like you were saying about how the toxicology laboratories then should not look at 17025 2005, right? Because there's no point. There's no point. And then and again, Brian, even though we're the current laboratories are in the year 2005, we are going to have to change by 2019. I know there's going to be more details, but that's what you're saying. By 17025, by 2019, and then ABFT will be hopefully working with the tox labs to allow them to extend. But the tox lab should focus on 17025 2017. Yes?
Yes, they should.
All right. Any other questions of either of these two before we see if there's other discussion?
If you don't mind, just going back to Brian's point, Pam, 17025 we're familiar with for testing laboratories, and I understand crime scene units generally go for 17020. Do you have any opinion on that in regards to, as an accrediting body? Do you think that's appropriate, or maybe you can't speak to it? I don't know. I just thought I'd ask you.
Yeah, I of course have an opinion on it. I have an opinion on almost everything. But what I would say about 17020 is it really depends. It depends on the level of what you're doing out at a crime scene activity, in my mind, on whether or not you would really want your accreditation to fall under the inspection standard or the testing standard. If you're doing a lot of tests out in the field, then you may want to stick with 17025. It might be the more appropriate standard. The other thing to consider in that is if the laboratory is already accredited to 17025, the management system may be easier to maintain if you just put crime scene under 17025 as well. And things that don't apply are just not applicable to crime scene. I will tell you that we are working on our own comparison between 17025, since it has been restructured and it now looks much more like the 17020 ISO standard, that we're comparing those two and adding in the ANAB requirements to see where the gaps really are, and if those two standards are really that much different once you throw in ANAB's additional forensic requirements that are based on ILAC G19. So those two programs may not be as far off from each other as people initially thought.
But in regards to doing testing laboratories currently, it sounds like 17025 is something we should be continuing with, I would say, rather than 17020, meaning controlled substances, firearms, latent prints, as Brian was mentioning. 17025 may be more appropriate.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I would agree.
All right. Well, thank you both. Appreciate you being here and appreciate the insight. Just one other point that I would ask commission members if they have any thoughts on. We did have a request from A2LA to be a part of this process. We did bring them in and listen to them. My recollection is that there were some concerns, particularly, among other things, with regard to their capacity to do what needed to be done here. But I would be interested in hearing from other commission members as to whether or not people have thoughts on the A2LA issue.
What did they want to do, Mike? They
basically want to be either our accrediting body or one of our accrediting bodies.
I mean, my impression of them was the same as yours when we heard from them, and I agree with Lydia that I think ANAB is doing a good job.
Other thoughts?
I just think whatever we decide, we should decide on one provider. We should not have an option of more than one. I think it's just too much work for the laboratories to spin around. Some have issues in regard to budgeting where the decision might be based upon who's the lowest bidder. Not talking about the quality of the work, but just your management system might alternate every 2 years. I agree. I think ANAB, they've got the experience coming from ASCLD Lab. And I also think, we've got the international standard. And I do think, moving forward, we see how much change all the lab directors are going to go through over the next couple of years in regards to being compliant with 17025 2017, being compliant now with the new ANAB forensic requirements that are somewhat adapted from ASCLD Lab and additional requirements they feel are appropriate. And then we're bringing in the ABFT requirements. So I definitely think, as Brian said, we've been looking at the comparison of accreditation programs since 2015. I just think we should make a decision when we think it's appropriate, but I think sooner than later, so the laboratory directors can focus on where they're going in the next 2 years.
Is there anyone who feels differently in terms of the comments made with regard to A2LA or the one provider as opposed to multiple?
Do we have any idea what the financial implication is of choosing one versus the other? I mean, are they going to charge similar amounts to the labs?
I believe we did ask that question, but I don't recall the answer off the top of my head.
As individual private providers, and Pam, if I'm incorrect, you can tell me, they have the ability to charge what they see, and I don't think we can dictate what that is. So there will be a difference, and obviously if you're putting two in the pile, they'll try and be competitive, which might drive them down and move it up. And I guess one of the questions was, will that also relate when you're looking at trying to be competitive cost-wise? Will that decrease the amount of assessors you have at a lab? So like one of the things we talked about, I think when A2LA was here, is I asked them about like one of my former employees at the NYPD going to that laboratory, how many assessors would you send? I think they said approximately 8. And Scott, you can correct me how many you had now, but we're used to getting like 20 or 25. You know, so I don't necessarily know.
17,
but maybe
Brian, it was 17 this year, but it's still significant for 4 days.
Yeah.
Wasn't the payment structure for AskLab Lab a scale depending upon the number of forensic specialists you had?
Yes.
Isn't that how it worked?
Yeah, and then it capped out at a certain point.
Out.
Yeah, thankfully,
So
capped out at a certain
right.
point.
I don't remember what A2LA, what their structure was.
Yeah, I know there is a financial aspect. That just maybe I wasn't being clear. The concern that some lab directors had mentioned was some of the bidding processes is mandated to take the lowest bidder. So they may have got all of their documents set up for ANAB, and then the lowest bidder, is one provider, and the lowest bidder ends up being a different provider, and now they've got to redo all their documents to meet that new provider. So that was the concern, not really the financial part. I think, as Brian was saying, it's a private vendor. It's, they have to pay, they have to charge what they charge. It was more about being dictated based upon the lowest bid that then requires the lab to change their management system, maybe on a regular basis, because the lowest bidder is going back and forth between the providers.
Now, that's a very good insight, and I appreciate that. Thank you. From my own perspective right now, given all of the comments that have been made around the table, I feel like there's a consensus that we want to pursue the ANAB ABFT organization in whatever form it's going to take after 2020, and that we're not interested in introducing another body, particularly A2LA, into that mix. Am I correctly understanding what I'm hearing around the table?
I think it's good to pick one body for simplicity for everyone, but we're also then giving exclusivity to that one body. So prior to making a decision, perhaps we could see what they estimate their cost structure to be and compare it to what it's been previously, and just to make sure they're not taking advantage of the fact that they're the only game in town.
My recollection is that we did ask them about that when they were here, but so I think we could go through the minutes and get that. We could certainly make inquiry of both of them for the next meeting. But I do, regardless of what they gave us for cost, you've got Scott's concern that then certain labs, given local or state regulation, would be forced to ping pong back and forth every 2 years. And secondly, regardless of the cost figure they gave us, my recollection was they had very serious concerns about their capacity, given the size of the organization, the amount of work they do. It didn't seem like they had the capacity to even do one major inspection. But certainly we can look into any issues with regard to the price structure and address this at the next meeting. But I think we should be prepared at the next meeting to bring this to a head. And the other comment I'd make is, we have been operating in this venue for, I think, certainly since I've been here, and I think since the commission first existed, where I think, we've been working with one organization, which was AskLab Lab, with the exception of the Tox Labs, which were allowed to use ABFT. But, so I understand the point of, saying we're picking, but there's a precedent of us doing that. And I think, for Scott's reason and others, there's some pretty solid reasons for us to do it. But so why don't, Brian, if you can have your staff take a look through the notes of the meeting when A2LA came, and what we have from ANAB, and just see if that sheds light on this issue of price structure, bring that to the next meeting. If it doesn't, you feel you need to reach out to the organization to do that.
Right.
And come back at the next meeting with some further information about price structure.
All right, we did request from A2LA and they never provided, but we'll make another request.
Okay. All right, anything further on this issue of the accreditation comparison? We will put this on the agenda for the next meeting. The next item here is familial search. Brian, can you give us an update in terms of applications?
Sure. To date, we've received 12 applications. 2 of those applications have been approved. One has had the MOUs, the Memorandums of Understanding, executed already and is at the state police pending analysis. One is still in the process of executing the MOUs with the requesters. The other 10 are still in the application process. The crimes that they're associated with are murders, rape murders, and serial rapes.
All right, any questions?
Yes.
Yes, Marvin.
With respect to the 2...
Can you hang on one second, Marvin?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead. Thank you. And I'm sorry. We just had some background noise here.
Yeah. With respect to the 2 familial searches requests that have been granted, did that go through the process where it got all the way up to you, Michael? And you had to make the decision?
Whether I had to or not, I did make, yes, they did come to me. They were reviewed pursuant to the process that we approved, and a decision was made.
And with respect to the making of the decisions, was there an adequate paper record established of how the decision was made?
All of the applications are written applications. Everything that I consider is in writing and is on the application.
And those documents are in your office?
They're not in my physical office.
Not so much your office. They're in a place where a subpoena could get them.
Absolutely. Yeah. No. We treat these as records that may well be needed for litigation in the future, and they're saved. I just try not to keep any paper in my office if I can avoid it.
I don't even want to know the location. I just want to know that
yes.
A defense attorney...
You want to know who's controlling them.
I want to know that a defense attorney who asked for a subpoena, that the records are somewhere, and that they can be gotten in the event that a trial has to be had with respect to the granted application.
Absolutely. We've attempted to set this up in a way so that there's written documentation of everything that happens and that it's all preserved so it can be fully reviewed.
Okay.
How many jurisdictions are represented by these applications?
Good question.
I can think of at least 3 off the top of my head. I don't know.
There's more than 3. So if you look at the individual counties that are involved, off the top of my head, sorry, I'm using advanced math, so I've got to use my fingers. At least 5. There might be more. At least 5 counties were involved.
Okay.
5 counties for 12.
All right, anything further? If we can, what I want to do is jump to lab disclosures, just because we have a number of people from labs waiting here. Do the lab disclosures, and then after the lab disclosures, we will address the issue that Marvin wanted to address. So if you can take us through the lab disclosures, Brian.
DCJS reporting.
Procedures for DCJS to verify function of the non-conforming.
Okay. The first item under lab disclosures is the Erie County Central Police Services. So the documents are in your binder, page 284 to 297. And the laboratory staff is available if people have any questions.
I did have a question.
Okay, stand by. We'll get them on the phone for you.
Okay, Tom, this is Shelley at the commission meeting in Albany. The commission members have some questions for you.
Okay.
Good morning. If you could just identify for us your name and your title, please.
Hi, this is Tom Grill. I'm the DNA technical leader.
Thank you for being with us. You have half the commission members here in Albany and another group of them in New York City, so hopefully the technology will work here. But we have a question from New York City for you.
Yes, I was just wondering whether there were 3 different analysts represented by these nonconformities or these corrective actions, or was it one analyst having a problem for 3 different proficiency tests?
It was 2 different analysts, actually.
And so 2 analysts and then 2 different tech reviewers?
Yes.
3 tests.
Over 3 tests.
That's correct.
That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
All right. Thank you, Thomas. The next laboratory is the Erie County Toxicology Laboratory. The documents for that are not in your binder. There are additional documents provided today, pages 539 to 550. Christine Giffen is in the room. I know you haven't had a second to look at them. I did have one just general question, so maybe just while people are looking through that, I can ask the general question.
Yes, sir.
So my understanding of looking at this, and we're up to Erie County and the additional materials here, blue 524, 539 to 550. It seems like there was a pipette calibration that had to do with the quantitation that was kind of the core issue. And I guess my thought was just, did you look at other quantitations you do, since they're also involving different pipettes, maybe not the same ones, but the way that those are done, like blood alcohol stuff, if there's other drugs that you do quantitative analysis, because I just worry that while you're looking at it with the one thing of the THC, which is a tetrahydrocannabinoid from marijuana, I'm concerned just that might also bleed into other applications or other things the lab does.
We did look into how our pipettes are handled throughout the laboratory. The issue with the pipette actually that it was leaking. It was that particular pipette. So we had a long discussion with the laboratory regarding how pipettes are handled throughout the laboratory. We did take a look at our proficiency tests to take a look at other pipettes. So that was the way that we evaluated pipette issues. All of our quantitations are performed up until the end of last year by 2 analysts who are my most experienced analysts, and they were the ones who alerted that there was a pipette issue to begin with. And by interviewing them, they were one gentleman had on his own been checking pipettes, so he was confident that they were within compliance. So what we did is we made that an actual procedure within the laboratory, where we actually now check our pipettes on a daily basis so that we could be sure that they were within compliance.
When you say there's 2 people doing it, that means they're not doing it in duplicate, right?
No. Some of the work is done in duplicate, but in general, I have 2 people who perform all of my quantitative analysis up until the one gentleman retired December of last year. So it's now been other people, which is again one of the reasons we felt that tightening our pipette procedure was a good idea, because we had some new people coming onto the quantitative analysis.
Other questions for Christine Giffen on that? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The next laboratory is the Monroe County Crime Laboratory. I've got members of that laboratory here in Albany if there's any questions. The documentation's in your binders, page 298 to 310.
I just had 2 quick questions.
Oh, sure, come on up.
So the drug that went missing, I was curious what the drug was and how much?
I was actually going to ask, was it a drug? It just, as I read it, it says an item of evidence in the drug chemistry section, but I think it's a similar question.
It is a drug, and it was cocaine because it had been tested before it was discovered that it was missing. And the total weight on that was 2.895 grams.
So still no idea where that.
Correct, and we're still calling back cases that analyst worked on at that same time frame because there is the possibility that item was packaged with a different case.
Have there been any other issues with regard to that analyst?
No. In fact, we haven't had this issue in our lab since I can remember, probably 15, 20 years.
Any performance issues with the analyst?
No.
And then on the next page, it says a portion of the analyst's work involving microscopic comparisons is being recalled and will be examined. Just give us an idea of what proportion, what percentage of cases you typically look at.
So we recall 25 cases, and within those 25 cases, there were approximately between 30 to 40 comparisons that were looked at.
Are you allowed to drug test the employees in the crime lab?
Not without cause. So, obviously, any type of personnel action I wouldn't be able to comment on, and it would be a separate process.
That whole issue is actually challenging because there's a certain amount of there's publications about base levels of people that work with drugs just from being exposed on a larger level.
Could falsely test positive.
Yeah, so obviously if there's a blasting result, you look at it, but if there's something that's a baseline, is that from exposure or is that from, actual use?
Is law enforcement involved at all in this?
Not at this time.
Not at this time. But
John, just a quick question. This was self-reported by the analyst, correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, they told you that they've lost the evidence.
Yes, so the analyst was checking their custody in our computer system and noticed that this item was still in their custody and not in their locker, and the analyst immediately brought it to the attention of laboratory management.
Just in regards to the second paragraph about the firearms examiner, John, do you have verification by another examiner, or this report was only looked at by one examiner before it was issued?
We do have verification by a second examiner. It is a blind verification, and a portion of that analyst's casework is also being looked at.
Okay, so you're reviewing two analysts, correct?
Yes.
Are they still off of casework?
One of them is back on casework, and the second one is not on casework, only because we're still reviewing those cases.
The one that's back on casework, and I apologize if I missed it in here, were there corrective actions that you took, or I don't know what the right term is, remedial actions, or?
Yes, so we took corrective action and did a root cause analysis, which included looking at those and reanalyzing a portion of their casework.
What did you find?
We found no other errors in the casework. As far as the comparison itself, we did note that, I know it's subjective, but in the scheme of things, it was a difficult type of comparison because both of the firearms were the same manufacturer and model and did have some similarities.
So was there anything, in terms of retraining or anything else with regard to the one analyst that was put back on? I guess what was the difference? Why was one put back on and one not?
Only in a delay of getting some of the casework back, and the verifying examiner isn't in our laboratory as much. They are a part-time employee.
Are you calling back all of their evidence that they've done before?
No, only 25 cases for each analyst.
Okay, if there's no further questions, thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
The next laboratory is the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner, Department of Forensic Biology. I know Meredith's there, but just for clarification, this was one of those things that it was an issue with the mortuary unit, not the laboratory. So they, by city statute, have to report it, but it's one of these things that's kind of a little out of their purview. So this was just a close out of that. And again, I don't know if there's anyone available in New York City or if anyone we can call if anyone has any questions to discuss it.
Meredith is here.
Okay.
Yeah.
If anyone has questions, I don't know if there are questions.
No.
Okay. Outstanding. Next laboratory is the New York City Police Department laboratory. Documents in your binder, page 324 to 330. Obviously, Dr. O'Neill is graced us with his presence. So if you have questions about that.
Usual NYPD screw up.
Okay, if there's no questions, the next lab is the New York State Police Lab. Documents in your binder, page 331 to 340. Members of the lab available if you have any questions. Okay, next laboratory is the Onondaga County Center of Forensic Sciences. We have a member of the lab available via telephone if there's any questions. Okay, next laboratory, the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. Close out of a previous corrective action. Members of the lab available if you have any questions. Documents in your binder, page 343 to 355. Okay, hearing no questions. The Westchester County Division of Forensic Sciences is next. Documents in your binder, page 356 to 360. Members of that lab available via phone if necessary. Bless you. Okay, lastly, the Westchester Department of Public Safety. Documents in your binder, page 361 to 365. And then additional documents provided today, 365.1 through 365.4 with the blue page numbers. And members of that laboratory are here in Albany if there's any questions.
I had a question. Who's here?
Good afternoon.
It's still morning. We have 15 minutes left.
Sergeant Jim Harrison, Westchester County Police Lab Director.
Rich Vandermeulen, Westchester County Police Quality Assurance Director.
Thank you for being with us. If I read these right, there was some mention of, well, first of all, this, if I understand it correctly, relates to an analyst where you were reviewing the casework and there was 13 errors found. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
All right. And there was some mention of the analyst being reassigned out of the lab during the time to meet the needs of the parent agency.
That's correct, sir. We're a sworn police department laboratory.
All right, so this was a police officer or some rank in the police department who was doing latent print work and then was reassigned within the police department?
Correct.
Does that reassignment involve any fingerprint comparison work?
Was their reassignment attributable to this?
No. What I'm saying is whatever assignment they went to, that new assignment, does that involve any latent print comparison work?
No, sir.
All right, so within your organization, you've put them into a position where they will not be doing this kind of work?
Our parent organization made that decision, yeah.
All right. And what, if anything, did you do to go back and check? You found 13 errors. Was that when you went back and looked at prior casework?
Correct.
All right. And how much of the work did you look at?
We looked at every case possible since the start of her employment or her assignment within the laboratory where we still had evidence.
All right. And I assume in cases where a report had been sent out as well, let me ask you this instead of assuming. The 13 errors you found, were those cases where the analyst made an identification and should not have, or cases where they didn't make an identification, should have, or what were they?
There was no false identifications, but there was a mixture of other analysis-related errors.
When we first started, there was a question of an exclusion, right? A fail to exclude, or a fail to identify an exclusion on a proficiency exam. So we went back and we checked all of this examiner's exclusion work on the exclusion decisions that were made, and we started to find some errors in the analysis portion. So moving back, before a comparison was made, before critical findings were made, errors in the analysis portion, where something was either deemed good for identification, but other examiners deemed it was only good for exclusion, or something of that nature. So then we expanded the case checking to every single case she touched. And that's where the total of 13 cases were found.
And you said there was no cases where the analyst made an identification that was found to be incorrect or inaccurate?
That's correct. There were no cases.
All right. And in cases where there were these other errors, was there follow-up that was necessitated by these errors? So, for example, if there was an exclusion that shouldn't have been an exclusion, was further work done on those cases?
Further work was done in those cases. In some cases, every other latent examiner in the office looked at that, and we all had unanimous decisions. And in that case, amended reports were given to the jurisdictions. Ultimately, there was discussion by the laboratory director with the Office of the District Attorney with those cases to see if any outcomes were affected, any pleas were affected.
All right. In the work that this analyst did in the past, did that work result in any reports being issued, aside from these 13 cases you found, where there were identifications that were made that, as far as your review showed, were valid identifications?
That's correct.
There were other cases where, if I'm understanding your question correctly, were identifications made in other cases by this analyst?
Yes. Again, and
yes.
just to cut to right where I'm going here, was the information that there were 13 errors found to be made by this analyst turned over to the district attorney?
Yes.
Are all of your cases from one county, so they involve one district attorney?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So if that analyst is ever called in the future to testify about a identification that she made or he made in a case other than one of these cases, the district attorney or the prosecutor is going to know that this issue exists?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Did you mention the defense attorney, Mike, or just the DA and the prosecutor?
Well, I'm assuming that if the DA knows, there's certain legal obligations in terms of what they have to disclose and what they don't that would take care of that. I don't know how they could possibly notify the defense attorney if arrests haven't been made, if they don't know who it is. There's one DA, I assume, for their whole county.
Right.
Who knows who the defense attorneys are. But if it's turned over to the DA, as I understand our law, there's obligations on the DA to turn information over. I just want to make sure it's not something the DA doesn't know about, so it doesn't make it into that process.
Yes,
that's everything I have. Thank you. Yes, Marvin.
Can you tell us anything about the background of this individual in terms of their forensic science training?
They're a trained latent print examiner in comparison and development, and also trained in crime scene.
By who?
Crime scene is done on the job, so to speak. Latent print training was at the time level 1, 2, and 3, provided by the state.
You say provided by the state. An agency of this state, New York?
DCJS.
DCJS?
And I can tell you we've moved away from the level 1, 2, and 3 training that no longer exists, and we're moving to what we think is a much better and updated model of training.
Right. So how long ago was this level 1, 2, or 3 DCJS training that this officer had? Was it years ago?
I believe
2013, 2014.
Yeah, 2013, around that time.
And between 2013 and the discovery of the 13 errors, has the individual obtained any other training from any other agencies outside of New York State or in New York State, other than DCJS? For example, have they gone to the FBI, to any program run by the FBI with respect to fingerprint training?
I'd have to examine their SOQ and get back to you on that one. I believe they have received other training since the end of level 3, but I believe the majority of that was through provided by the state.
Mm-hmm. And this individual is currently not working on any cases, correct?
Not within our laboratory. They've been reassigned outside of our laboratory.
Could you assure the commission of this, that in the event that individual was reassigned back to the lab, that prior to allowing that person to do any casework, that you would report back to the commission that the person's working?
This person will not return to the laboratory. That will not be permitted.
All right.
And nor will this person be doing any kind of forensic work within the police department. All that work is done through our laboratory solely.
Okay, thank you.
That will not happen.
All right.
Okay, so that answers that question. This person is not coming back.
Correct. This person will not return.
Okay.
I just want to make one.
Mike,
Oh, go ahead, Judge.
Judge has a question.
I didn't quite understand your response to Mr. Green's question. The 13 cases in which there were errors were all with respect to one county, and you've informed the district attorney of that county. Now, has this examiner done work on cases involving other counties within the city of New York? I'm sorry, it's all Westchester? Oh,
It's all Westchester County. We have 43 customers within the
I got
county.
mixed up. I thought we were still with the city police. So strike my question.
I just want to make one comment, and that is I want to commend you for doing, in your organization, for doing fingerprint work within an accredited environment. I think, as much as any of us hate to see this happen, the fact of the matter is you were doing it within an accredited environment. You caught the fact that there was an error. You went through a process and reviewed the cases. You identified and did what you could to correct any other errors. You notified the prosecutor. Again, as much as we hate to see that, I think the fact that you chose to do this within an accredited environment, brought this matter to the attention of the commission, put some checks and balances in place, and I think you should be commended for doing that.
Thank you.
I just have a couple of questions. Sorry. Jim, I'm just trying to understand did this individual only do 17 assignments over a span of 3 years? Because it's stating that there were 17 assignments were re-examined, and you decided to re-examine all prior casework. So
I'm not sure exactly which document you're referring to.
And it may because I just got this document this morning. It's please accept this email transmittal as an update for CAR 2017-01, and then it has a timeline.
Got it. I'm looking at that.
Because I'm just getting confused because sometimes we throw numbers around. It says here on the second sentence, it was observed that one analyst had manifest 7 errors out of 17 assignments that were re-examined. And then on May 22nd, I decided, and I'm not glad to you, Jim, to re-examine all prior casework. So I'm just trying to understand what was the totality that was looked at.
Correct. You want me to answer?
You can answer.
We had a proficiency test corrective action that we were working through. This analyst was an affected person.
Okay.
In the process of re-examining their casework back till their last successfully passed proficiency test, we had uncovered those 7 errors.
Okay.
Out of there's a pool of cases that could be re-examined. When you're searching for certain errors or places where there could potentially be an error to actually uncover something, you hone in a little bit further on those. So out of the 17 assignments that we examined of that particular analyst specifically, we found 7 errors. We found 0 errors in the other affected analysts. So then the other timeline that I'm referring to is when I decided to ultimately re-examine all of their past casework.
And was that done?
It was yes, it's completed.
And how many approximately was that? Was that 50, 100, 200?
From for the purview of this corrective action, which references 17-01, about 150 were looked at.
And of those 150, you found 13 errors. That's where, because everyone kept saying 13, I couldn't find the number.
Yeah, that would be 6
for a total of
13, combining 7 from
7. Okay.
And
so
7 and 6.
Over 100 cases, you found 13 errors, correct?
Approximately. The first.
Yeah, I don't mean to. I'm just trying to get the picture. Sorry. So the only other question I had. You felt that the errors were significant enough that this person should not continue in the laboratory.
To answer that a little more specifically, the errors uncovered required an amended test report. The analyst was reassigned outside of our laboratory for many different reasons. The chief of that, the most predominant one, was the needs of our department to staff. Our laboratory is small. In 2012, in 2015, we had 12 people. We had 1 analyst reassigned. So we dropped 1. In 2016, we lost another analyst reassigned. And in 2017, this particular analyst, another analyst reassigned. We've been seeing about a 10% drop each year.
Okay. So just my one last question is similar to what the question was to John Clark. Was this evidence not technically reviewed or verified? You know, is there not a second examiner involved here?
If I may answer that, prior to any of this happening, our verification process involved verifying all identifications, whether criminal, whether non-criminal. Immediately, 2 days after this initial problem in the proficiency was noted, right? This was a case where the proficiency test had a print which was identified. Our examiners failed to identify it, so they were excluded. Okay? We set into policy 2 days later that we would do verifications on all critical findings. So no longer would we limit it to identifications, we would expand it to exclusions, failure to exclude, and also inconclusive results. So we would try to improve and fix that problem. Ultimately, when we did more digging and found more errors at the analysis phase, we decided we would beef up our re-examination process to include cases where there were a multitude of prints which were analyzed. Later, we determined that may not be enough, and most recently, this was very recent, just the other day, we put into policy where we now have a verification process in the analysis phase also. So when a fingerprint, or excuse me, when a latent impression is analyzed and it's deemed to be of value for identification or of value for exclusionary purposes, we are now going to have those decisions verified by a second analyst, hoping to completely eliminate this from happening again, to really tighten it up.
So the errors did not result in anybody being wrongfully arrested?
No.
Were there any?
There were 2 cases.
Identifications made as a result of the reanalysis that led to an arrest, or
no.
Okay.
No. They were minor in analysis, but in totality, it became significant.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen. This concludes.
Marvin's got a question.
Yeah. What was your assessment as you sit here today of what caused this problem? I mean, 13 errors, it's quite a few errors by even the standards of this commission. Generally, when we see that number of errors, we like to hear from the people on the ground who investigated what you think the problem is. And the secondary reason for asking that question is your disclosure, which I commend you, that you're losing an analyst every year, one down. Is your caseloads increasing? Are the analysts under very, very great pressure? Is that what caused the problem here? Or is it just a question of sloppy work, bad habits? What's your best assessment?
Well, to start at the end of your question, I had to make a strategy decision. Our late and print casework had realized over a 5-year period about a 20% decline year over year. We've had spikes in other areas of the work that we produce for our customers, but we had less late and print work, and we had more late and print examiners. For what the actual error was, the actual problem was the 13 errors. If you dig down and analyze each error, 2 of them were typographical, but they still required an amended report. In one instance, perhaps a latent print was determined to be of value for identification where it was only good enough to make an exclusion for. Or perhaps they said it was of no value, but it actually was of value for something. There's a couple different ways that scenario can happen. So they weren't exactly one repeated problem. Mm-hmm. So the problem seems to be with that particular analyst analysis. That person is no longer within our laboratory for me to remediate any further, to dig down any further. So I'm not stuck with how to make a policy improvement to preclude this from happening from any other future new analysts we may receive, or to prevent it from occurring again. That's the best that I can do, I feel, right now for this correction. Does that answer your question?
It does. Do you have in your latent print unit anybody who is not a police officer? Do you accept for employment people who are not police?
I'm not in control of that for the staffing, but we only have sworn police officers in the latent print unit. We have 2 retired New York City detectives within our firearms unit, but they're still sworn. They carry firearms.
Thank you.
Okay, this concludes the lab disclosure portion of the agenda.
Thank you for being here, too. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Marvin, do you want to address your issue?
Yes, just very quickly. I'm trying to understand whether DCJS gets involved in DNA testing. And if it does, what kind of testing does DCJS do? Do we have a DCJS lab? And if it's not a lab, are the other places where we, as the DCJS, interacts with laboratories, the only one I can think of is the uploading or downloading of DNA information to the CODIS database. Am I correct in any of those assumptions?
We do not. We have one laboratory. It's a laboratory that this body accredits. That's a latent print laboratory. So we are an accredited latent fingerprint lab, accredited by ANAB and by the Commission. We do not do any DNA testing at DCJS. We don't have a lab for it. We don't have people. We just don't do any.
But do we get involved? Does DCJS get involved in uploading issues to the CODIS database with particular labs?
There's a process by which information, I should say, profiles get uploaded into the database. We are one part of that chain. Among other things, the part that we play includes, for example, verifying that the criminal history that the person has associated with that sample would include something that would justify that sample being uploaded to the database. So, we do play a role, but it has nothing to do with identifying the profiles, with developing the profile. It's basically a record-keeping function, looking at different records and making sure that for example, the conviction is such it would justify the case being uploaded.
So basically, the bottom line is, the answer to my question is that DCJS and its employees have nothing to do with DNA identification.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right, that's everything we have for our regular session. We do have one matter to address an executive session. So can I have a motion to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to a current investigation or matters that may lead to the appointment, promotion, demotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular person?
So moved.
So moved.
All right, and the second?
Second.
All in favor? Anyone opposed? All right, thank you. So we'll be in executive session. So anyone who is not a commission member or commission staff, I'd ask to leave the room for our executive session. Thank you. On its way back.
We're done?
No, we just have to end the meeting for him. All right, we're all set. We're back recording now. I'll first report that no action was taken in executive session. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? All right, all in favor? All right, our next meeting is June 15th. The main site will be New York City. And again, I just want to thank everybody for their participation and their work, and particularly the people in New York. Thank you for braving the weather. Greatly appreciated.
So he would.
You're
welcome.
Take care. Thank you.
He would bring a civil action, related sometimes to the criminal.
Like an hour and a half into the meeting.
By the